But I think we'll start without Stephen this week because I don't see him here. All right, and we're being live streamed. So here's the post to the link to the text is in the chat. Welcome everybody to the Kenneth Smith seminar. This is we've been doing, as David says, we've been doing this for 6 years, but this particular seminar is on the book Millennia and Microcosm. We've only been doing that 3 years, and we're entering the 4th year now. Millennium and Microcosm is a book that tries to show us how we can look at the world from more than one perspective at a time. So we don't have to be stuck in the modern perspective. We can use it when it's useful, but then take it off when it's not useful and put on other perspectives. If we go through the exercise in this book, then we walk away with three perspectives: the medieval ancient, the European ancient, the European medieval, and the European modern. And the premise of doing this is not that Europe is great, but that we have a lot written about these three perspectives. So we're able to actually do the work required to wrestle with our own tendency to project our perspective on top of other people's works, even when it's wildly inappropriate. And the practice of learning to stop doing that in these two cases is going to allow us in the future, after this seminar, if Kenneth Smith is right, we could then go off to read about medieval China, or we could read about ancient Egypt, or I don't know, shogunate Japan, and learn how to sift through the wealth of material to find the things that show us how radically different that perspective was than our own, and to learn to do justice to seeing with that set of lenses. And the reason for doing that is because every perspective sees some things but misses others, including our own. So we really don't want only one tool in our toolbox, lest we become the man with the hammer. We want a rich toolbox full of perspectives. And that's what Kenneth's kicking us off doing here. So this is week 167 of Millennium Microcosm. We haven't met every week, but most weeks. And the book is organized in three sections. After 3 chapters of introduction, the first section of the book is a single chapter, chapter 4. That's the ancient worldview, and it's so short because Kenneth has taught it so many times. He was able to boil it down into this one chapter. And what we spent a bunch of time doing was unpacking it over the course of a year and a half to find all of the things that he was talking about in there. Now we're in the second arc, and the second arc of the book of the three is medieval civilization. We've just wrapped up year 1. That's taken us into chapter 8. There's more chapters to go, but now we're doing a new thing, which is we're augmenting Kenneth's text with readings from other writers, other Christian or medieval writers. Ari joined us. Hi, Ari. At some point, I'm hoping we're going to spend some time with Kabbalah, for example, get into some of the Jewish mysticism of the Middle Ages, and other writers as well. We'll spend some time with Islam. We're trying to get at what is the medieval worldview, not just what's the Christian worldview. And then when we wrap this up, whether it's in a year or whether it takes a little more than a year, because this is a wealth of material, then Kenneth will take us into the third section, which is the modern view. And you'd think, well, why do I need to study the modern worldview? I have it. But the whole point of this book is to look at the modern worldview after having learned to see through the ancient worldview and the medieval worldview. Because when they look at the modern, they see completely different things than when a modern tries to look at himself. It's the fish can't discover water problem. That's what this book is about. And so the book finishes with a tour of the modern worldview, that from the perspective of the ancients and the medievals, and how does that shake up our understanding of ourselves. So we're in paragraphs. Last week we finished up paragraph 12, but by finished up, we really only meant, whetted the appetite. As Donald pointed out, we got to the end of paragraph 12 and it was so juicy. There were such great Kenneth sentences in there. And we didn't really take we were at the end of the 3 hours, and we didn't have the time to really delve into it. So we're going to do it this week. I'm going to post all the sentences from, you can either follow the link to chapter 8, or I'm going to post right in the chat the sentences that we're talking about. And we're going to start with the sentences we already covered, but we're going to wrap up with, the last thing I post here is going to be what Donald wants to dig into. And I will be calling on Donald's when we get there, because it's going to be interesting. Also, during today's seminar, we'll do more discussion of the Gospel of Thomas as our supplementary homework reading. And I have some interesting things prepared on that. All right, so it's all there in the thing. So I'm just going to narrate us through, and then I'll highlight when we get to the sentences that made Donald perk up and go, wait, 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 I want to talk about that. So let's start from the beginning. What Jesus taught was heartening wisdom about the fount of spirit, the gift of seeing what continues to give itself, whether men close their eyes and hearts to it or open them. But to the craven, all that is heard when, quote, immortality is spoken of is a release from the great pain and burden of a myopic and compulsive thanatophobia. For these, Jesus' teaching is merely a way of making life safe for those devoid of the aristocratic virtue of courage. And of course, aristocratic, he's alluding back to the ancient worldview and what is an aristos and so on here. But there is no way of making life tolerable for the pathologically cowardly, who cannot face any of the pain or duress in human or natural existence. Life, said one comic, maybe it's not for everybody. Such personalities manufacture their own opiates inwardly. Their lives become inevitably a bulwark of denials and delusions about the character of life itself. The fear of dying and the fear of life's trials as well do not affect all personalities the same way. For some, these instill a compulsion and obsession against which an otherworldly religion is needed to elaborate a counter-compulsive or compensatory world, a corpus of delusion. And now we come to the sentences that made Donald especially perk up. Aristotle understood the simple reality of moral engineering, that courage is the heart, the foundation of all other virtues and values. Lacking this, one will have no other values. Life presents very different obstacle courses to differently endowed individuals. But the worst obstacles of all are those inherent or ingredient in their own subjective perspectives. So this is a discussion of character. When he talks about our own subjective perspectives, he's saying how the world looks from within our character. And each of us has a different character. And that character turns our act of seeing the world and looking at it and trying to understand it into something like a Rorschach test. And someone who has the character of a doulos or a banausos will see the world very differently from each other and very differently from how an aristos sees the world. This is all harking back to chapter 4. The Greeks had this notion that the metabolism of the basal metabolism of the human mind has two gravity wells, two centers of interpretation. The first center of interpretation, the one we're born into, is gnosis. And that is the ability to immerse yourself into the flow of feelings, the flow of experiences, sensations, memories, so that you become a whole with the world around you, highly attuned to it. You know, everything gets you excited or sad, or you're totally in the flow of existence. And it has certain strengths in that it tethers you to reality. Like you notice things, you're paying attention to things, you're not lost in la la land. There's a hilarious sequence in Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels where he stops at an island full of philosophers who spend so much time lost in debate they have to have assistants called flappers around who slap them in the face from time to time to remind them to come back down to earth from their fanciful wanderings and remember not to trip over that stone, not to fall in that pit. So maybe it's time to take a shower, these sorts of things. And this is the thing that a doulos, the immersive, naive gnosic personality doesn't suffer from, right? The animals experience life directly. There's a parable either in Webb's or otherwise where Kenneth Smith says some people say that human beings should learn from dogs because dogs are more in tune with reality than human beings are. When a dog itches, it scratches immediately. It doesn't think, I wonder if someone will see me scratching. I wouldn't want to be embarrassed. They just immediately experience and go into it. And they're in a shameless sort of mode. So this is the first of the basic metabolic functions of the mind, this gnosis. And I'll call on you in just a second, Rena. This gnosis is the core, is one of the two. And the Greeks believe that one of the fundamental character types that you see in people, and they put them in their plays and stories all the time, is the kind of person who rises to that level but never gets past it. So they're bound by their own parochial experience and their feelings. They might be very good at noticing what's happening right now, but they might be very bad at planning for the future or making any kind of long-term society or what have you. And the Greeks thought that those people should be slaves. They called them douloi. So Rainer, go ahead. What's on your mind?
No, I wasn't clear on the word you used. Gnosis, Gnosis, right?
Yes,
Yeah, okay, got
Gnosis.
it.
And they counterpose that against noesis. So I'll put them in the chat there. Gnosis and noesis.
Noesis, noesis,
Yes.
knowing.
Yes. And different Greeks at different periods use these words in different ways. But the way Kenneth Smith is using it is the naive form of gnosis is the form in which you use gnosis without the supplement or help of noesis. And he says that's a half-witted strategy for life. The Greeks believe, and the 19th century Germans believe this is a half-witted strategy for life. You're using one of your faculties and you're ignoring the other. It's like human beings develop noesis for a reason. It adds a supplement or an extension to gnosis that is extraordinarily helpful for us. And so people who sort of refuse to plan, who say, I have to live each day as though it's my last, I don't want to be overly intellectual. I don't want to, impose myself on reality. I just want to live each day as though it's my last. I want to feel everything as intensively as possible. These people have certain advantages and certain disadvantages. And the disadvantage is, they can't see the bigger picture. Their own experience looms so large to them that they think that's the whole of reality. There's a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon in which he's been eating frosted sugar bombs, a bowl of frosted sugar bombs on Saturday morning, only he poured a bunch of sugar on top because there wasn't enough sugar in the package to begin with. And by the final panel, he's all jittery and Hobbes is looking at him like, I don't know, you may have gone a little too far. And Calvin says, why are you bouncing around so much like that? So you should hold still because he can't distinguish his own jitter from the world. He thinks the world is jittering. And to the Greeks, that's what they think the naive form of gnosis is. You think that if you're angry, then everybody's angry. The situation is angry. If you feel love and affection and happiness, well, then everybody should be happy. To the doulos, it's very hard for them to understand other people are real. Even people you can't see right now or talk to, they're real too. There's real stuff happening all over that's outside of our experience, and we have to take that into account. And that's not what naive gnosis is good at. Naive gnosis is good at plugging us into this here now. And Hegel talks about this, the this here nowness. So, so that's one of the two faculties. The other core metabolic faculty that we're building this discussion off of is noesis, and Hegel talks about this as well. He calls the kind of thought or thinking that happens with gnosis, the first form, he calls it begriff. And the second form he calls Verstand. That's the German equivalent to gnosis and noesis. And begriff has the advantage of being very concrete and sensorily loaded, full of information that's taken directly from experiencing reality, but it has the problem that it misses the larger picture. Verstand is what we grow when we grow dissatisfied with being teased because we're too emotional, when we're dissatisfied from getting bad grades because we didn't study. There's a lot of things that happen to us in our youth. Those of us on this call probably all have a healthy dose of noesis because there was some dissatisfaction that happened. And Hegel says what happens is we start to push back against and reject the earlier self who was so immersed in the moment that he couldn't see the larger picture. And we do that so that we're not shamed. We do that so that we get the rewards of planning ahead. We do that so we can gain competence in a field that requires study, whether it's as scholars or whether it's as carpenters or what have you. We have to master the rules of a craft, whether it's because we join a legal system, become scientists, all the things that involve learning and study and practice and education and mastering a schema or a system. This is all associated with noesis. That's what that faculty of the mind is for, the second faculty. And it grows out of and on top of gnosis, according to the Greeks and the Germans. And Hegel called it Verstand, like related to our word understand. Um, and the thing about noesis and Verstand is it starts out being an incredibly powerful prosthesis. It's like, yeah, I can start to predict that every spring at a certain time the ice is going to melt, and if I plant my wheat at the right time, then I can get the crop to come sooner than if I wait for the, warm sunny days. And so people build these stone calendars all over Europe to remind them, when is it time? When is the equinox? Ah, the equinox has arrived. Now I can go plant. They're able to be more successful and more effective because they're incorporating this planning faculty, this, as Hegel says, abstractivizing, systematizing faculty of the brain. That'll, but the price, says Hegel and the Greeks, of doing that is that you have to create a quiet space within which to think. In Begriff, you can be immersed in the moment. If it's loud, then it's loud. If it's quiet, then it's quiet. It would be a disservice to reality to push it away and not be part of it. But Verstand grows impatient. If you're trying to study and your college roommate just wants to party all the time, you might have to either put down, set down rules and say, I'm sorry, you can't party here after 8 p.m. Or you might have to find an escape haven. Maybe you escape to the library or a study center somewhere. You push away from the flow of experience, the intensity of experience, to create a larger and larger space within which to think and plan and make notes and look ahead and and the result of this, says Hegel, is that on the one hand you get a greater ability to see the larger world that's outside of your parochial experience because you can theorize, you can look for patterns, and that's great. That's a power. But the downside is, in order to do that, you've had to separate yourself from experience. You're more likely to miss things when you're abstractivizing. The more Verstand you do, the less Begriff you do. And in the course of doing that, the more you become disconnected from reality. And next thing you know, you're the manager of a federal agency, and all the frontline workers know you desperately need to spend some money on this, but you haven't been a frontline worker for 25 years. And you no longer know what it's like to do that job. So instead, you start prescribing what your department's going to spend its money on based on your theories and your ideologies and books that you've read and other managers you've talked to. And your frontline people start to hate you because you're making their life terrible. You're withholding the funding that they desperately need to do the thing that's actually part of their job in reality because you're disconnected from reality. So when people talk about the Washington D.C. bubble and say, as you rise up in the government and you move to D.C. to be able to talk to all of the other managers, and what happens is you gradually create an echo chamber in which you have a vision of how reality works that's disconnected from reality, and it leads to bad decision making. And Hegel says this too. He says to abstract is to be in error. Yes, it's powerful, but it's also error prone. So what we're talking about here with character, and I'm belaboring this, for folks who've been here before, it's belaboring, but for folks who are newer, like Rainer, I'm hoping that this will be helpful because this is some of the background from chapter 4 and the other stuff. So the idea is the Greeks had the idea that there are these two basal metabolic functions of the mind. We evolved to have both of them, and we need both of them to correct each other. You need Begriff to point out when your beautiful land of theory is full of shit. He's like, yes, it would work that way in the land of theory, but not the real world, right? That's Verstand, getting disconnected, and Begriff can leash it and pull it back to reality. But Begriff needs Verstand. Because if all you have is your own parochial experience, it's hard for you to understand the bigger universe. I mean, the scales of magnitude. How big is Jupiter compared to the Earth? How big is the sun compared to Jupiter? How big is a white giant star compared to our sun? It just gets bigger, and these scales go on and on and on, and they have so little to do with what we've experienced in our own parochial lives that we need some other faculty to give us the capacity to measure it. So we get units and we get big numbers and we get theories and we get all of this stuff helps us to grasp the larger cosmos. So each of them corrects the other, but the problem, say the Greeks, is that each of them is addictive. And so what happens is people get attached to one of them and then they don't want the other one. They reject it and they hang on to the half that they've got. And you end up with large numbers of human beings living a half-witted life that satisfies them much of the time because, whether it's because they want the juice of life or whether it's because they want the power of intellect and education and training. But either way, these half-witted strategies for life create enormous problems for Homo sapiens. Aristotle elsewhere says, Homo sapiens is the animal that has reached the stage of evolution where he doesn't use the word evolution, but development, where Most of our problems are not caused by volcanoes and storms and earthquakes and leopards. Most of our problems are caused by us, whether it's ourselves or other people. The human beings are the biggest obstacle to human beings, and no other animal has that situation. And he says, this is largely because of this tendency we have to slip into these two half-witted modes. And so they talk about this as character. The doulos is the character type of human being who is addicted to begriff. And that's all he wants to do. And he doesn't really want it. He uses Verstand, if at all, just as a little prop, sometimes as a helpful extension. And a banausos, I'm going to put both of these words into the chat. Doulos versus banausos, right? And they correspond. Gnosis versus noesis, begriff versus Verstand, doulos versus banausos. A banausos is someone who has rejected the begriff-centered life of a doulos, dissatisfied with it, doesn't want to be merely a creature of appetites and feelings and experiences, wants to theorize, wants to learn, wants to master subjects, wants to be a programmer or a lawyer, what have you. But the problem is, the more they go into it, the more they become disconnected from reality and start living a life of abstractions. And all kinds of catastrophes happen as a result. And so the Greeks believe there is a third type called the Aristos. And the Greek Aristos corresponds to Hegel's third mode of the mind, which I will put in here. And that is Vernunft. And Hegel is translating into German, and for a modern audience, the Greek conception of character types when he's writing about this in the 19th century. And he says what the Greeks say and what Hegel says is that the third mode of the mind is the one in which you permit neither begriff nor Verstand to be your master. That is, you insist on using both faculties and having your sense of self be someone other than those faculties. You say, I am not my intellect, and I am not my feelings. I have feelings, and I have an intellect, and I want them to serve the larger me. And so I'm going to wield both of these faculties, even though it's less comfortable than just picking one. And I'm going to use them to criticize each other. I'm going to become self-skeptical. I want to know what my feelings are. I don't want to be disconnected the way a Banausos is. Not because I always trust my feelings, but because it's a source of information. Even if it's giving me bad info, I need to know that that's the info it's giving me. And conversely, I need theories and ideas and education, but I'm not going to assume that those theories and ideas and education override reality. I still want to be using actual experience as a check on my theories. And if I find a problem with my theories, I don't want to say, well, I'm going to suppress the problem and pretend it doesn't exist. I'm going to say, my theory must be wrong. My theory needs to be corrected. So the scientific method is an example of an attempt to leash Verstand and Begriff together. To say, you theorize, you look at the world, but then you theorize. You theorize, but then you check your theory with data, and you look for data that proves your theory wrong. You don't just try to prop up your theory. That's what a Banausos would do. You try to tear down your theory. You try to falsify it, like Karl Popper said. Because if it's real, you won't be able to falsify it. But if it's fake, you'll find plenty of evidence that contradicts your theory if you look for it. This is an example of the heuristic life. So all these are three different character types. When Kenneth is, and now we can go back to the text, and I'm going to call on Donald in a little bit. So hopefully he's getting all revved up with his Plato and Socrates here, getting ready. So when it says, when Kenneth writes, the worst obstacles of all are those inherent or ingredient in their own subjective perspectives. What he's saying by subjective perspectives, he's talking about the thing that your character imposes. It's like a mirror and lens system that stands between you and reality. Your character is doing all kinds of interpretation of what you're seeing before your conscious mind even gets a chance to think about it. You notice some things and you don't notice others. And all that's being done automatically by your character. And so this is alluding to the Greek idea. If you're a doulos, things that you're afraid of, or that you want to eat, or a pretty girl walks by, or anything appetitive, or anything that you have strong emotional associations with. It could even be a theory, but it's a theory you love because you love the teacher who told it to you, and you adore this theory, and you want it to be true. There are all kinds of ways in which experience and emotion can do this thing. But if it's present in the picture, it's warping your perception of reality, so that you don't see what's really there. You see a Rorschach test that's designed to satisfy you. And the exact same thing happens if you're overly intellectual. You're disconnected from reality. You have certain theories you prefer over others, certain training that you've gone through as opposed to others you haven't. And you're going to look at the whole world in a way that bends it to fit into your theories. It's the man with the hammer problem. And the Greeks believe only the third type has a remote chance of seeing parts of reality the way they actually are. Because every time they have a distortion from one of their other faculty is brought to bear and says, hey, I think that's a distortion. I think you're missing something here. Verstand might tell Begriff, I think there's a bigger picture that you're missing that you don't have any evidence for, but maybe you should go look and theorize. And Begriff comes back and says, yeah, that's a nice theory, but look, what about all of this evidence right here? We have to actually take it into account. You can't just ignore the things that contradict your theory. This is a character type, the third type, Aristos. So these are the subjective perspectives he's talking about. Life presents very different obstacle courses to differently endowed individuals. So I pause to take a breath. Sorry for that long run, but I tried to take you through two years in a quick hurry. That's part of 2 years of this seminar. And he's alluding, you see how he's alluding to it there, just at the tail end of a sentence when he's talking, because this is a rephrased version of one of Heraclitus's most famous quotes, ethos anthropoi daimon, which people translate as character is fate. The worst obstacles of all are those inherent or ingredient in their own subjective perspectives. Their character creates obstacles. And this
Character
goes back,
is
yeah, go
character
ahead.
is state. Did you say character is state?
Fate.
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 Okay.
Yes. Let me there, I dropped it into the chat. That's that's the most common translation. It's not a literal translation, but it's the most common translation of Heraclitus's ethos anthropoi daimon, which is one of Kenneth's favorites and one of my favorites. Um, it's we'll save the more complicated breakdown for another time. But basically, ethos can be thought of here as character. Anthropoi is man, and daimon is like a god that rule a minor god that rules over you, and therefore it generates your fate because it's like Poseidon controls what the oceans do because he's the god of the ocean. Your character is the god of you, who determines what you notice and don't notice, what you're drawn to and what you're not drawn to, what you find convincing and what you don't find convincing. All of this is happening unconsciously from the character. This is Heraclitus's line, and Hegel's and Kant's. So all of this is an example of how you can look at some straightforward sentences, seemingly straightforward sentences in Kenneth Smith, but if you start to learn what his keywords are and who his different philosophers are that he's been reading and what they've been saying, you start to see the parallels in his text. And you can get to the point where, especially if you talk to him and he actually tells you he does this practice before he writes these chapters. He collects his list of quotes. He probably had an Aristotle quote handy. He certainly had the Heraclitus quote handy. Earlier in this paragraph, whatever comic it was who said life, maybe it's not for everybody, he had that in mind. He had some parts of Jesus. Maybe it was from the Gospel of Thomas, maybe it was from Mark, maybe it was elsewhere. He had a number of things in mind when he was writing this paragraph, and the text weaves through them and either points or hooks into them. And the more you read Kenneth, the more you start to pick up these hooks. Like Donald and David can both do it like that because Donald took classes from Kenneth for quite some time. David has interviewed Kenneth at great length and recorded the interviews. And I've read a lot of Kenneth and harassed him a lot and thought about it a lot. So this is why I can do it. So Donald, are you ready to talk about courage as the foundation of all the other virtues? You want to come off mute and share with us a little Plato, Socrates, Aristotle here?
Well, I mean, Kenneth is certainly right here when he says Aristotle understood this, but Aristotle understood it, I think, because Plato understood it and all the others. I mean, courage is where you begin. It's the virtue behind know thyself, the beginning of all moral life for the classical Greeks. So That's right. But I guess what I wanted to do is contrast that with the beginning of Christianity, because I can't, people are, correct me, there is no Christianity without Christ. Christianity begins with a man. I guess what I'm trying to say is the Greek notion. Any man who can find courage within himself can begin the learning experiences necessary to develop the other virtues, the heuristic virtues, and become a good man in as well as, in the same sense that you would say somebody's a good Christian, you know. Not that good means the same thing in either case, but I think that's what, and so that I see as a profound difference between the Greek view and the Christian view. And I won't say anything. Well, Plato wrote the Laches on the virtue of courage. So he wrote a whole thing on it. I'll leave that alone. But for the Christian view, and this has always caused me problems, and all Christians are willing to correct me here. John 14:6, no man comes to the Father except by me. Well, Aristotle couldn't, Heraclitus couldn't, Plato couldn't, Socrates couldn't. You know, all of those men couldn't have come to the Father. No Jews prior to sometime early ADs could have got. How did they get to the Father? I don't know. Maybe Ari can answer that. How did they begin the negotiations that led to the strong covenant between God and the Jews? Christianity is different. It has this one man, as far as I can see, or person. I don't know maybe we don't want to call him a man. I'm not making a theological statement about the nature of Jesus. I'm just saying, without Jesus, no Christianity. I don't know. It may be true that without Buddha, there's no Buddhism, but maybe, maybe that's not as unusual as I think. And then, now, I'll argue against myself a little bit because thinking on this sentence led me to Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood and Hazel Mote's returning from war and begins preaching the Church of Christ without Christ, whatever, and railing against the Harry Dean Stanton character, the blind preacher, who turns out as a fake. In fact, all the other preachers turn out to be fakes, except for one, the unbeliever, Hazel Motes, who preached against them. He becomes the true Christian out of his disbelief. And I don't know if, I feel like Flannery O'Connor has pulled jujitsu on me here, and I thought I had a good argument going, but she makes an argument, I think, kind of contrary to 14:6 of John, that men, where do we get Christ when we need him? In a sense, one will step forward. Someone maybe the one that railed against Christianity as a bunch of fakes will step forward and show the truth. So I don't know. Some real Christian or real Jew can pick this argument up, but that's the thing I wanted to say last time, that I think this is very interesting, because it seems at first like Christianity is in the business of just condemning people. They're it's sort of like you're taking physics for the first time and they show you that space-time cone, and all the things on the outside of the cone can never interact with the things on the inside of the cone, because there's not enough time for those events to ever interact, because they're separated too far in space. And you think of like that with Christianity. Well, there's just an awful lot of people that either for spatial or temporal distances can't be Christian. But then sometimes I don't like, I wouldn't say, I don't know what, Flannery O'Connor's not necessarily orthodox in her view, but is that there is a way, if nothing more, railing against the falseness of Christianity, one comes to the truth of it. I don't know. Please, somebody relieve me from this.
Thank you, Donald. Much appreciated. Yes, the role of courage. That's it's such a Greek idea. One of the things we talked about in the first 2 years is the idea that there was a stage among the ancient Greeks where there was a fad for publicly killing yourself. And you'd think, well, how does that catch on? That doesn't seem like a winning combination for any culture. But it was during times of trouble when the Greeks, some of the Greeks felt that other Greeks were losing their way as a people. And they would say, we were originally a warrior people. That's why we conquered the Hellenic Peninsula. That's how we got here. That's why we rule. That's why we're not slaves. We're conquerors. We're warriors. And the key virtue of a warrior is courage. Our entire ethos is based on the idea that first courage and then the rest. So if they see a late epoch, sorry, a late stage of the epoch among the Greeks where they're seeing an absence of courage, they worry, well, what's going to become of us? Who would we be without courage at the center of all of this? And so they would feel like, the biggest, most important thing I can do with my life is to actually demonstrate what it looks like when you have the warrior ethos so strongly that you're not afraid to die. You're willing to die even just to pass on the lesson of courage. And so people did it. They would kill themselves in public. Go ahead, Donald.
That's certainly true, but it's certainly true, I think, also that how courage stands in respect to other moral virtues, how to, it has a lot to do, I think courage is a necessary virtue because we just don't know how things are going to turn out. The future is opaque. In many cases, the present is opaque too, and the past can be pretty obscure in itself. There are a lot of so just to begin the philosophical journey to develop the other virtues, to even become aware of them and what their nature might be and what your own nature might be and whatever, requires the beginning. Maybe it's really Confucian, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. But if you're going to undertake to live a philosophical life or an heuristic life, you begin that not knowing where you're going to end up. And that I think in Greek courage a central characteristic of it is it hinges on the not knowing. You know, if everything were certain, or as I talked a little bit last week, we were immortal and there were no consequences to our actions, well, there would be no need for virtue because we'd be all okay no matter what happened. But the Greek lesson is what happens does make a difference. And in some of those things, in some outcomes, we're not okay. And we need to know the difference. So that leads to sophrosune. What are good things for myself? Piety. How do I treat the sort of unknown possible deities that might be in the world? What we'd normally call justice. How do I treat other things and people in accordance with their nature? You've got these other virtues to develop, but unless you have courage, you're never going to learn about them. You're never going to know how to practice them. You're never, and it's not me, you falsely attribute Aristotle to me, which is not. In the Nicomachean Ethics, how are you going to have the sense to go find that aristocrat and follow him around? Not knowing what he's going to do or show you, or not knowing. You know, it's like we all want it to be a done deal, no risk. Harry, come to my aid, please.
So Ari, come off mute and come to Donald's aid.
Of all things, I'm checking out at the grocery store right now. How about I come back in a minute? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we got you.
Yeah,
Okay.
we'll put you back in line.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Okay, bye.
Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I guess I am very simplistic. And the first thing I want to say is that I want to quote the whole verse, right? Instead of just, no man cometh unto the Father but by me. The verse says, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no man cometh unto the Father but by me. And the way I understand it is in context. The disciples started to perceive that Jesus was going to leave them. And he tried to give them courage, because we're talking about that. And he told them that what he was teaching them, he was providing a way for them to be with the Father. And I think the statement is probably one of the core tenets of Christianity, which emphasizes that the access to salvation, which is coming to the Father, and access to God is achieved through faith in Jesus. That's what he was preaching. And that faith took a lot of courage just to believe. And that's the way I interpret it. Probably a lot simpler, but when you do the whole verse, it gives a different meaning.
Thank you, Sharon. Yeah, it's very helpful to have a larger context. It's one of the things I do most often when I'm reading Kenneth is he'll give us a little quote and it's, chewy and all, but I go try to chase down here the text so I can read what's around it, because that often adds a great deal. And then I can tell, when is Kenneth actually saying this entire passage and the stuff around it is what I want to talk about, and when is he saying he could care less about what's around it? He just likes the wording of this particular sentence, because sometimes he goes one way and sometimes the other, and you sort of have to play it by ear. But for Donald's point, the issue here is that this is something that no Greek would ever say. Back in the pre-Christian era, no Greek would ever say there's only one way to
Right.
understand reality. Yeah.
Okay.
It's too fundamentally alien to the Greek worldview that everything gets bottlenecked through a single person. But in the case of Christianity, by the time we get to the gospel according to John, it's starting to become a central tenet that there is only one right way forward. And there's only one oracle, if you will, to give you access to the sacred truth. And the oracle is in the form of a person. So whether you take it as John means it, where it's a spiritual relationship, or you take it the way that some other writers mean it, where the religion derives from the teachings of this man, and if it weren't for that man, we wouldn't have the religion, which is what Donald was describing. What's interesting is that either way it works logically. Um, the statement is core, whether it's an article of faith or an article of history. It's curious. Rainer, go ahead, Sharon. You wanted to add something?
Well, I just have a question. You said this is what's said in the verse is a very un-Greek thing to say. Yes, but isn't that why Jesus was regarded as a heretic? And as he tried to change the way of thinking of the status quo at the time. So yes, it says as an un-Greek, and he tried to have them adopt this new philosophy.
Yes.
And it was problematic. And as we went forward, that's why Constantine had to put the hammer down, I guess.
Yes.
Am I seeing that too simply?
No, that's right on. I mean, what we're seeing in this, this is Kenneth's whole argument about the medieval epoch, is that these teachings are revolutionary for the era in which they arise. They are what Nietzsche would call a revaluation of all values. It's an overturning of what matters and what doesn't matter, what's good and what's bad. What do we focus on and what do we not focus on? It inverts everything, and what you're talking about fits in beautifully with what Kenneth is saying throughout these chapters. It's like, yeah, this is a slap in the face against the old wisdom. It's saying the old wisdom was flawed, and we need a new wisdom. And here comes the new wisdom, and you're going to be shocked by it, but that's normal. Go ahead and confront that shock. Work your way through the difficulties of seeing a new worldview, and you'll find something spectacular. That's the argument. Rainer, what's on your mind?
Yeah, so first of all, let's see, audio's up. I'm pretty ignorant about religion, Catholicism, even Judaism. So what I'm saying now is just, sort of like hypothetical and probably going to be an exhibition of my misunderstanding. But it seems like, okay, interpreting everything we said here in the last half hour or so, with regards to courage, it seems like another, way of looking at that would be putting truth first in your life as an essential part of your being. And in that context, then referring to Jesus as the beginning of, religious journey would be equivalent to putting faith first. Okay, faith in Jesus, faith in the Gospels. And so that would highlight the divergence between Judaism and Christianity, because that was something that I'm assuming, and I'm guessing on all this stuff, that Judaism wasn't subscribing to. It's not that they didn't have prophets and everything, but they didn't, but I think that Judaism is probably, I'm guessing, was working its way through, connecting truth, like you're saying that the ancient Greeks were connecting truth and daily experience, and somehow realizing that they needed to, in a balanced life, they were merged, and yet that had to be explained. And so Judaism seemed to historically be a process of explanation and rationality. I mean, we have Talmudic scholars who are constantly analyzing what should be and what isn't. Whereas in Christian faith, being the operative word, we're setting aside truth. Truth doesn't matter. Only faith matters. Or faith is, rather, it's a hierarchy. It's an inversion of the hierarchy. So in Judaism, you have rationality and belief, and in Christianity, you have belief and rationality, that hierarchical order of precedence. that's just a sort of like intuitive guess on my part as far as historically what the undercurrents, philosophical undercurrents were that differentiated the two different beliefs there.
Yes. Yes, that's very consistent with what Kenneth's talking about here. He uses a triumvirate of sources of meaning: nature, God, and man. And he says in that order, with nature being the highest, that's the ancient ethical system. It says nature trumps even the gods. In polytheism, the gods are only expressions of aspects of nature. None of them created the world. The world created them, or projects them, if you will. That they're not transcendent gods; they're immanentalist gods. And this is something that most books on the Greek myths never talks about, because it's natural for a modern reading ancient Greek myths to assume they must have the same concept of the relationship between God and nature that we do. But of course, they don't. They have exactly the opposite. But the medieval conception, Kenneth says, part of the core of the revolution is this overturning of sources of meaning. So you get God, then man, and then nature, because now man rules over nature and God rules over man. It turns into this new structure of meaning, and nature, especially among the early Christians, during the 100s, 200s, 300s, there's, well, actually all the way until 800 or 900, there's an enormous fight in Europe as they're trying to convert the pagans and heathens to be Christians. They're saying, you must not turn to nature for any of your answers, because you've been worshiping nature gods who we now call demons. And it's a habit with you to keep turning to the creek or the waterfall or the fire or the tree for meaning. So we need you to never, ever, ever look to nature as a source of answers. You must always look to God. And for that reason, nature gets demoted all the way down to the bottom of the priority list, even under man. And they cite Genesis, where God tells man to name the animals and be in charge of them as their authority for saying, stop getting your answers from nature. So this is related to what you're talking about, the relationship between faith and knowledge. In a nature-based system, it's not unusual that you end up with Aristotle or Heraclitus or others saying that if you want to understand the world, stop listening to other people and go out and experience it yourself. And Heraclitus says, I trust the things I can see and hear more than I trust what people tell me. And you should too. This is proto-science, right? That Aristotle and Heraclitus are doing. But by the time you get past Augustine and into the medieval period proper, that's considered heresy. You must not do that. You have to get your faith. You have to have faith in God, and God will give you the answers. And you absolutely should not be looking to nature for anything. Now, this becomes a crisis during the Crusades, and we'll get there eventually. Because the Arabs have a different relationship to nature that's allowing them to use more advanced, weaponry, and in order to catch up, the Europeans have to put science. They have to start acknowledging the value of science and knowledge, but for a good 1,000 years, they are just absolutely anti-knowledge and pro-faith. It gets really extreme before it starts to correct. So thank you for bringing that up. I mean, it's right on topic. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I think you've pretty much said it, but Aristotle would say that any man who'll do the work can come to all the knowledge that I have. Socrates, Plato, Heraclitus, they all do it. You can get as far. Aristotle, yeah, well, was Aristotle an Aristotelian in the sense of St. Thomas? No, he wasn't. Or he put no faith in Aristotle. Other, and I think that's a quite different view of where knowledge and virtue come from. And Kenneth, he gave it one whole sentence there, and we can keep talking about, that, wait a minute, this is He's reminding us of how things were in the Greeks, for the Greeks, in the middle of a discussion of how Jesus taught. And it's like, I think we're supposed to notice, hey, this is a big change. And I think it is. And I'll be quiet now.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, after I call on Sharon and Ari, I'll bring back just what you were saying. You know, why is this here? Why are we going so hard Greek in the middle of a discussion of the Christian concept of immortality, which, as you may recall, is where we opened this paragraph with. And it's the reason we're talking about virtue, the reason we're talking about courage, is because we're talking about fear. Now, what does Jesus mean when he talks about immortality? First of all, how do we know when it's Jesus speaking and when it's Mark or Matthew or Luke or John or somebody else? That's one set of problems. But even aside from that, even if we think it's Jesus speaking, what does he mean when he talks about immortality? And his point here is that if you lack courage, then you probably are afraid of death. And so if you're afraid of death, immortality emotionally, subconsciously, characterologically, immortality has to be about evading death because that's what you're afraid of. That's what you want. That's the present you want Santa to bring you. And so if you worship a Santa Claus version of God, then immortality can only be, yay, I don't have to die. And his point here is there are a lot of other ways to read this. I mean, immortality can mean very different things. Certainly, when Achilles chooses immortal fame over a long, happy life, it's not because he's never going to die, right? I mean, the whole point is he's going to die. He's chosen death, right? That's what the whole choice of Achilles is. But he chose it for a reason. He chose it to be a teacher about the meaning of courage, and that lesson about the meaning of courage would live forever, even though he would die. And that's a very different concept of immortality from from John Donne's "Death Be Not Proud," which is just about I don't have to die. I'm going to live forever. Um, it's a radically different interpretation, and it part of what Kenneth is doing is illustrating how different the same text can be read depending on the value system of the reader, the character of the reader, the value system of the reader, the perspective of the reader. He's trying to say it is frequently not obvious at all what Jesus actually means in some of these passages because Jesus is writing from a perspective we don't have anymore. And among other things, he's writing as a Hellenized Jew. He's writing as somebody who has been soaking in the Hellenic empire of Alexander the Great that stretched all the way over to India, and it's still having its influence across that time. And now the Roman Empire, which although it hasn't conquered Judea yet, its influence is felt all over the place outside its own boundaries. And so all of these concepts are present in the perspective. These notions of courage as the parent of all the virtues. That's there. This notion that there are more important things than death. There are greater lessons to focus on. That's present in the value system. And I was just reading before our seminar today. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but the Gospel of Thomas. This is the Marvin Meyer translation with the Harold Bloom a commentary on it. I was just reading the Harold Bloom commentary. Oh yeah, there you go. Beyond Belief. Thank you. I was just reading the Harold Bloom commentary, and he makes the point that part of what we see in Thomas is it's hard to explain in terms of later movements, later Christianity, later Gnosticism. It doesn't fit with them very well. But maybe part of what's here is that these are closer to the authentic sayings of Jesus, and other writers didn't understand them and just edited them until they felt like they did. And that explains why we see something so different in Mark and even further different in Matthew and then Luke. And then John is completely different from Thomas. But he says that's only one possible explanation. He says, Harold Bloom says, maybe there's two things happening. Maybe it's closer to the authentic Jesus, but maybe the authentic Jesus has been doing rabbinical studies, and he has discovered an older stratum of Judaism that had been lost in the contemporary Judaism of his day. Maybe he's stretching back to an older concept of the relationship between God and man, and he's trying to bring it back to life and resurrect it and get people thinking in these really old Jewish terms again. When we get to Thomas, we'll come to that. But it underscores the exact same sentence can be read many different ways, depending on what your interpretive framework is. And that's Kenneth's whole point of this book. That's what this whole book is about. It's not just text, but nature and the self. They look completely different depending on what your value system and assumptions are. Sharon, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, that very same verse, and I just want to reinforce what you said about interpretation, because that very same verse, I think, speaks to the questionable nature of God in Christianity in the early days. And when you go through the Gospel of Thomas, you can see that there were very different versions of it, because this God seems petty, exclusive, and angry. And it's in the very opposite way of what he wants you to believe, that he's a gracious God of love. But that's not what this verse implies. And I did quite a bit of studying about Thomas, like, the website you sent us to. And it's a lot of different opinions and different interpretations of who Jesus is and ultimately who God is. And that's what I came away with.
Yes, thank you, Sharon. We'll dig into some more Thomas today. Our big Thomas push is going to be next week. I'm ramping up for it. We'll do a little Thomas this week, but some more introductory work. But yeah, and one of the things that characterizes Jesus, Kenneth talks about this a lot in his books. Otherwise, in Webb's, Kenneth writes in a parable form. I mean, parables, paradoxes, and paradigms is his subtitles for both of them. And he says, he's imitating Nietzsche. He's imitating, Abraham Lincoln. He's imitating Jesus. And he writes in the intro, these guys wrote in this condensed form that's like philosophical poetry, where there's so much meaning packed into every word and comma, even, that you really have to work at it to find all the meaning that's in there. And people have noted for a while that Jesus writes in parable form so that it requires interpretation. And it's what makes Thomas so interesting by comparison with the other gospels, is that the other gospels sort of pretend Jesus is just saying this stuff and you just have to hear it and you'll follow along and understand. Mark is less that way. Mark has more of a sense of there's things here that those without ears to hear and eyes to see are not going to understand. But Thomas says it right out front. And I'm just going to quote this. We did this last week, but I'm going to quote it again. And this is from the Marvin Meyer translation. These are the hidden sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Judas Thomas the twin recorded. And the first thing is, and he said, whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death. It's focusing right out of the gate. The very first words that the Gospel of Thomas says Jesus has said are talking about the fact that you have to interpret. You can't just take it on surface value. Your interpretive framework affects whether you're going to understand it or not. And he clarifies that in the second quote, where he says, Jesus said, let one who seeks not stop seeking until one finds. When one finds, one will be troubled. When one is troubled, one will marvel and will rule over them all. And so again, there is this notion of struggle, that the text doesn't lend itself to us. It's not lappy. It's not transparent. It's obscure, and it's obscure on purpose. For some reason, the obscurity is part of the intent of the way that it's written, and it's forcing the reader. And remember, these are dated to around 50 CE, only 20 years after Jesus' death. This is saying it's not okay to approach this in a naive way of assuming that however you see it must be right. It's saying that people who argue over the meaning of it, because to me, I feel like it says this, but to you, you feel like it says that, and which of us is right? Right off the bat, the text itself is saying that's the wrong way to read this. You have to puzzle it out. It's not going to be what you want it to be. If you get there easily without being troubled, then you didn't understand it. Because if you actually found what I'm saying, it will trouble you. You're going to be troubled. You're not going to like this interpret the real interpretation of the words is going to be difficult. So any easy answer you have is the wrong answer right off the bat. Right? This is what it's like literally he's saying it. And it's you know it's part of what makes it's ironic, Kenneth's writing this existentialist philosophy, after 2,000 years, and there's been all this biblical criticism, there's been the rise of atheism, there's all these different things out there that are alternatives, but ultimately, Kenneth agrees with the Jesus of Thomas in saying that, to understand the world and to understand texts that have been written to try to emulate the hidden qualities of nature and the world, they require you to struggle with your interpretive framework. And if you don't do that work, that interpretive framework struggle, then you're not going to be capable of being either philosophical or religious. You'll be something else that passes for philosophy or religion. Some kind of, as Kenneth likes to say, it's some, if all you do is settle for the interpretation that pleases you, and you don't struggle with it and dig until you find harder lessons in it, then it's not existentialist, it's escapist. And that's, basically what Thomas is saying that Jesus is saying in the year 50. There are ways in which Kenneth is radical, and there's ways in which he's hyper conservative, and this is one of them, that he's conservative. Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Sure, yeah. So I wanted to answer Donald mostly about giving my opinion, which, as to quote Reiner here, it'll probably be a bit of my ignorance revealing itself. But at the same time, that's also maybe me having imposter syndrome, where I do study this stuff a lot and I do know a lot about it. But at the same time, I'm happy to be wrong, and someone can come along and correct me or see these videos online and know that I made mistakes. That's fine. But essentially, to answer the question of what Judaism thinks, or what's its sort of its source of authority, and I want to give a framework that I was reading one of our favorite authors, Hannah Arendt, her Between Past and Future, I think, right, and let's get the title right. Between Past and Future, and essentially talking about the nature of authority. And if I want to simplify hers, authority in this case is really ideas, and ideas give us the ability to use power properly through consent and agreement and cooperation and even competition, all these kind of things, but in a healthy framework where we can have a shared narrative. And to do that, to say what is Judaism's source of authority, what are the ideas, what's the background for this? I say it's interesting, it's nice, but it's also a little bit complex. I'll try to keep it as simple as I can, but I can't carve this sculpture with just a few quick chunks of rock. So I think the idea is like this. It starts off very ancient, but also a weird protest against the ancient version of the heroic story, where you have a story of a few great heroes, and they embody literally a few virtues. You have Abraham, who embodies generosity, which in Hebrew is chesed, and then you have his son Isaac, which is really the nullification of this, or the almost the Griff and the Verstand and the Rift is really much this sort of synthesis, because it starts with Abraham, who's got generosity, which is like an excess of things, and then you have his son Isaac, which is a strictness of things, which would call maybe discipline, but in the Hebrew it's gevura, and this is like a strict letter of law. If you're punished, you did this, your punishment is exactly that. And then their son Jacob, so the grandson of Abraham, represents a unity of these things, a synthesis, or really not so much the words negating the negation, but really both like negation and elevation by limiting it, right? So you have essentially generosity being then limited by strict justice, and you have some sort of completeness in this. And there isn't a specific word for it, like Shalom or something. The only thing that gives us a clue to it is his name, which it used to be Jacob, is now Israel or Yisrael, and it means one who wrestles with God. And essentially, it's kind of a wrestling between or a tension between, I think, being generous and strict. And then you have maybe there's a bunch of other characters, but the other major character that embodies a specific virtue is Moses, and his virtue, which is apparently maybe the greatest of all virtues, through these being the books of Moses, is humility. And humility is, in this case, Rabbi Sachs translates humility along the lines of what C.S. Lewis does, which is humility is not thinking less of oneself, but thinking of oneself less. So it's essentially that you think very much that you have a great potential and a lot to do, but it's not about you. It's about the world at large, right? And so this is where like you have this strange version of the Homeric epic where you have these heroes who embody virtues and it's their story. And then essentially from a Jewish point of view, we have almost this epigenetic or version that somehow those character traits get brought down through the generations, and all of us have some generosity that's attributed to Abraham, or some strictness that's but you get the idea, and humility that's attributed to Moses. But essentially, that is one of our sources of authority that seems very begriff to me. That is just tradition, as Hannah Arendt will talk about the triumvirate, as she calls it, authority, tradition, and religion are the source of all of society's workings. And to me, I see that as authority. She says specifically as like ideas. And so we haven't got to ideas yet, but this is really the tradition oriented, which is this is just passed down from one generation to the next. You just experience it. You just do it. You just do what your ancestors do in the sort of tradition. There's no abstraction here. There's a pure embodiment of living a life. It's an embodiment and it's a practice. And then there's the next thing, which the whole Judaism changes, and that's kind of the nature of the story, is everything changes when they are freed as slaves, as a nation from Egypt, and then they receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. And Moses brings down the tablets. That's the idea. But even before they bring down the tablets, there's a scene at Mount Sinai where all the people are there, see the thunder and hear the lightning. And essentially they hear God speak. And it's so overwhelming that they can't handle it, that they essentially want to kill themselves. They want to rush the mountain and die. And then they have to hold themselves back. And so instead, Moses brings down these tablets that embody these things in engraving into stone. And so that's where it changes to like a Vernuft. This is all about abstraction. These are just a set of ideas that are going to be a system of rules that you're going to follow that give authority. But again, there's like, instead of a negating of the negation, it's the elevation of each other, that the tradition of the ancestors is then elevated by the noesis of these ideas in the Torah as guiding principles. And together they bring about some sort of harmony, that you're not just your set of rules and you're not just your ancestors. You're doing something else. And this idea of a free society is supposed to be built out of this combination of these two things where they limit each other or they bring each other into being. It's complicated, but it's very similar in a lot of ways. I relate very much to this idea of a Hegelian dialectic, or it's definitely a dialectic. And then I also really related to what Hannah Arendt, I'm reinterpreting her words in the seeing that authority really meant the Torah, or essentially a relationship with God. But then there's also heritage or tradition, which we don't have any direct access to that. And so the way we do that is we feel essentially a relationship with our parents because they teach us how to live. And then you pass that all the way back. That's the relationship of these great people with God. And again, like Donald was really challenging in a strange way, like, well, what gives us this ability? Well, two things. Supposedly we were all witnessing to this event at Mount Sinai where we received the Torah. So we all got the instructions and we all heard the words. But there's another thing, which is, how did that even start? It's like, essentially, how do we get through there? It's almost like the Jesus idea that you can't know the Torah except through the ancestors. You can't get to the Father without the Son. And so in this case, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, and then even Moses, they did something transcendent. Somehow they were able to be on we usually use the language, they were on some sort of high level, like an Aristos, perhaps, some sort of high level where they were to be able to bypass or transcend their limited humanness and then start interacting with God kind of directly, which, to be honest, is very, again, like superhero mythology, like beyond what I can reconcile as a modern human. This sounds like fiction, right? But again, it sounds like fiction because if you buy into it, it's still kind of like fiction because it's something you can't access yourself. There's only a few great people in all of history that can sort of do this. But then what I can do is I get access to the book, right? I get access to the writings of these things and the systems. And again, these systems have to take the twofold. There's the systems of laws, which are totally noetic, and then you have a story, which is supposed to be your story, like a pure mythology. It very much mimics logos and mythos in this sort of sense, and noesis and gnosis. There's an embodied practice that relates to your story, which are like what we call the commandments, but really the mitzvahs. And these are like how you live your life, your daily practice. And then they have some abstraction behind them, which is essentially the principles. And those are all grounded in the fact that this is the way that generations before us have done this practice of integrating both a narrative and a rules book, right? You have a system of rules that are context independent, and then you have a story which is your context, and somehow you're supposed to bring them together in your own life in sort of your own free way, where you have a structure, but then you have freedom within that structure to sort of live your life. And so that's my best answer to Donald for how Judaism sort of frames this authority of how you convince your children into drinking the Kool-Aid, so to speak. Right, right. How do you get them to believe? Well, so this is I believe because I live this way, and then I live this way because of these sort of principles and rules and the systems that I get very lofty and excited about that all mean something to some big picture somewhere, right? So it's supposed to be a combination of these things. And again, I think it's interesting that it's less about, I don't know if there's English is just does a bad job at this, but it's less about the negation of a negation. And these two things together, they elevate each other. Again, it's more like Heraclitus, they bring each other into being, like the brain and the body. One makes the decisions, the other one carries it out or something, but you can't have one without the other. And essentially, this is the central idea of what it means to be holy. Holy is based on this word kaddish, which really means to separate. So you have these two distinct things, like a male and a female are kaddish to each other. They make kaddish each other. They make each other holy by being separate, but forming a relationship where they essentially have a covenant, and they bring each other into a being. And if either one breaks the covenant, they both stop existing. And this is actually how I understand in a more, this will be heretical for a moment, the way that God it really is a facsimile of our creation, that we bring into being the manifestation of this godlike entity, which is just an idea. Well, that has to be embodied in us, which is often used as the name of God. So whenever we have blessings, we're saying, bless the name of God. Well, what are we doing? Blessing the name of God. We're increasing the name of God by embodying this idea in your body. But at the same time, the idea can't live without a body. You can't have a kingdom without a bunch of subjects. You can't just have a king by himself. Otherwise, that's just he's a loner, an isolated person on an island. He's just a loner, who has no relationship. So again, the core of this is the holiness or the covenant or the dialectic is at the core of this. The real authority of all of this is some sort of like sophrosune, some meta level principle, which is really relationship. There's only bringing two separate things together through relationship that they bring each other into being. And it's something like God partners chose man. This idea of the man is the image of God is something along the lines of in the Talmudic work or in the mythological work of the Zohar. It's like we sanctify God and God sanctifies us. And essentially, without one of those two elements, the other doesn't exist. And this is why we're essentially given the privilege and responsibility and kind of terrifying power of bringing God into being, and God brings us into being. And without one, the other doesn't exist. And it's a weird reversal that a lot of times there's this idea that God doesn't need anything, that God is all powerful, God is this being of whatever. No, in the Hasidic masters, the Hasidic work, which is a more modern version of the mystical work, essentially says, no, God needs us. God is a created being, and therefore he needs creations. And if he doesn't have us, he doesn't exist. And he kind of threw his investment into us. And it's kind of the reason that he puts up with all of humanity's awfulness is because he needs us. He sort of put his investment into our bank. And therefore, we have a large obligation to do the work of creation and be partners in creation. And that what we do here really matters for this world and for the future, that it really matters. So that was long, but okay. I hope that was good. Yeah, time to shut me up. That was long.
Great.
But yeah, thanks. Good. Okay, great.
That was great, Ari. Thank you. And,
Thanks.
and this is why, I mean, even aside from the fact that we love having you on these calls, you have such a critical role to play during this middle passage when we're talking about the medieval worldview, because if all we talk about is the Christian version of medievalism, we don't really understand medievalism. We're looking at a parochial version of it. We really need the help of the Jewish perspectives and the Muslim perspectives to break out of what would otherwise be a really limited perspective. There's a lot going on in medievalism that you can't get from, say, the Roman Catholic Church of the year 1000. There's even within Christianity, the Greek Orthodox Church has a completely different interpretation in the year 1000 than the Roman Catholic Church does. So we have to triangulate on it, and the kinds of things you're talking about are essential to this. When we really get into Gospel of Thomas, mostly next week, we're going to do a little this week. You're going to find that Harold Bloom talks about himself as having a background as a Jewish mystic with a crossed with Gnosticism, and so his interpretation of Thomas is fundamentally a literary interpretation in which something being a fiction is not a problem. That's like it doesn't lose any importance just because it's fictional. It might be more important if it's fictional. He likes fictions and fictional characters, and he sees a lot of value to them that non-literary critics have trouble internalizing. But what I thought was fascinating is that he talks about his background in Jewish mysticism and in Gnosticism and Kabbalah specifically. So it reinforces the extent to which we're going to need to be able to weave in and out of the Jewish thought in order to see the larger picture here for this section. And it's not something that Kenneth focused on in these chapters. He focused on medieval Christianity and its relationship to the ancient worldview, especially. I mean, in some ways, if there's a problem in the structure of the book Millennia and Microcosm, it's that we know more about the medieval epoch than we know about either of the epochs around it. And this is for Rainer's benefit, I suppose, more than anyone's. Is one of the things that we said when we first started this book is the medieval epoch, which is just like normally erased. We don't talk about it. We don't teach it. It's just we hand wave it. The biggest problem with that is that the ancient epoch, we know how it ended, but not how it began. And the modern epoch, we know how it begins, but we don't know how it ends. And of the three, it is only the medieval epoch that we know both the beginning and the end, as well as the middle. It is the only complete picture we have. And as a complete picture, that makes it an important basis for comparison for understanding either the ancient or the modern, let alone both of them. And so actually, it should take more time. We need to take, there's more to be found here in the exploration of the medieval worldview than there is in either of the other two, because the other two, we only have half the picture for each of them. So digging into the Jewish theology and mysticism, digging into Muslim theology and mysticism. If at the end of year 2 of the medieval section, if we all together decide we want to go a little further, and we might not, we might be totally ready to go modern. But if we decide we want to go further and put a third year in, that might be when we talk about Chinese medieval perspectives and Japanese medieval perspectives and medieval perspectives in India and Africa, because they all had medieval perspectives. As we like to say, the divine right of kings, which is the catchphrase of the medieval worldview in Europe, is matched by the mandate of heaven out of China. You can see the similarity in saying that the only people who should rule are those who have the backing of the sacred. And the sacred will now be the top of the source of meaning. So we'll see where we are at the end of this next year. We might go a little further, but thank you, Ari. It's very important what you're saying. Joe. Oh no, I was just about to call on Joe and he dropped off. Curses.
Rick?
Rainer.
Yeah, just a brief interjection. Are you
Please.
saying that you're going to leaven the discourse going forward with through medieval history here with notions, Judaic notions and understanding of what was going on in that part of the thought? Yeah, okay, great.
Absolutely. Yeah, we have to. We have to. And it's in doing this, I don't think we're not in any way betraying Kenneth's intentions. I mean, he's trying to make sure we see all three epochs, and I think we see it better when we get the fuller picture. he was working to a deadline. He was working to, what does Gary Groth have time to publish in the back of the Comics Journal? I think this is all stuff he would have expanded it with. Joe is back. So Joe, you had your hand up, Joe. You want to comment?
Yeah, no, I mean,
Oh no, you're all digitized.
and I appreciate it actually
Joe,
what
your
Ari
audio
was
is all
sharing,
broken up.
can you hear me?
Your audio is all broken up and digitized.
Is it better now, or
Yeah, it's better now, but your image is frozen.
is it better now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, I really quickly, hopefully this, holds up here that I think that what Ari was saying was actually very interesting. And when he started talking about the idea of how to think about yourself less, when he was speaking specifically, about Rabbi Sachs, and essentially, kind of getting outside of yourself and having a relationship is, that's where meaning is created. But then you have to come back to what you were saying earlier, and I think that this is kind of essential to the part of the discussion, and it answers, I think, to some degree what Donald was getting at. So the idea that how is this your understanding of reality, essentially driving this relationship? Why is virtue important in the first place? That's really what the question is. It's then how is it that you arrive at what this idea of virtue even is? Like, so the idea when you're saying God, man, and nature versus nature, God, and man, and there are various, combinations there that you could use with that, but just using those two, I think that you're starting to think about the relationship between the finite and the infinite. And you really have to think about that, how both of those would go about having a relationship with the finite and the infinite. So that the idea that where if your combination is, God, man, nature, there's something that is outside of the present moment, so that you're kind of living for something more, right? And so that there is a value to be had in the future. Whereas if you have the nature God man idea, that the value is actually derived from that very moment that you're in. So, but either way, that what they're trying to get us to think about is that our relationships and with each other, right? So this is where virtue is becoming important. Now, having this all kind of set up is I think I find to be the most important thing of them all in order to be a life that is virtuous is that of one that you actually there's a certain degree of authenticity that exists. And so you have to actually believe it to be true because that's what that's how you're creating meaning. So that why am I doing this in the first place? And this is like essentially where awareness is, kind of critical, where you even think awareness kind of comes from. If you think, your awareness comes from essentially nature. I mean, essentially, when I say nature, I say God, man, nature. But if you think your awareness comes from nature, God, man, right, there's that awareness, and these are how your relationships are developed. And this is fundamental because one is a relationship with the other through God, and the other one is a relationship with the other is a way of kind of, as a way of, just you and the individual, and that meaning is derived from that relationship alone. But they're both saying that their, relationship is, there's value in this idea of virtue to begin with. However, you know, uh, the way you feel reality is actually structured is then going to drive your ethical decisions. And to the extent of which they will actually live out those beliefs, is how much do you believe it to be true? And I think that this is where sometimes obviously institutionalized belief systems become very perverted. So I think that when we're talking about this in particular, we can go down to the how uh, at a high level it would be it's appropriate to say that um, a lot of these beliefs, all these belief systems, are trying to understand the nature and structure of reality. It would be wrong to say that they're the same in the sense that obviously they differ in their particulars. And Ari just spoke to that in a very eloquent way, right? So that but again, what is it that really makes virtue important in the first place? And if you don't answer that question, then you're really kind of starting from a point that you're just not really aware, because you're just taking information in and you're just acting. You're not thinking with any type of, you're not really consciously thinking, I would say, about your decisions. And there was one other point that I think that it was, and I forget exactly what Ari said a moment ago, because we were in a conversation together about a week ago, uh, or no, maybe a couple of weeks ago. And, he talked about essentially where the rules, that your rules of inference are actually derived from. And I felt that that was very, very interesting because when we had our conversation, we talked about it in terms of, worked a little bit off of uh, a on my own, something that would be look at something as like science and the relationship between science, art, and ethics. So where do your ethics and governance systems actually come from? And I think that that's an important question to answer as well, because I think that if you start to think about how the nature of the world and how it exists, and then the narratives that we then create, and then from there, we come up with a set of a framework that allows us to infer and how to act in the world. So, I mean, that this is, and these are degrees of consciousness that we're now talking about. So, whenever we're having this, and then from there, well, why are you doing it in the first place? Why is the relationship in the first place really important? And I think that that's where you start to see, well, maybe I should be courageous, because maybe there really is something. And even the idea that an individual only that sees value in the present moment, there are still timeless principles that exist, meaning that the timelessness is what your actions do and how they have an impact on the world and the people around you. So their idea of timelessness, it's not, and this is where the finite and the infinite relationship, this is how they both deal with them. One deals with the infinite in this idea, I'm going to die and this is it, and I'll go to, I'll go to heaven. Or no, well, yeah, one, I'm going to go to heaven. The other one is going to say, and even, just even, but it doesn't have to be, it could be any belief system, or that this is it. Either way, what you view as timeless, that you're viewing the virtues as timeless if you think that this is it. Um, you're viewing the virtues as a way to reach a place that is timeless. And this is why, okay, why is it important in the first place? But they're just arriving at. So, I mean, all this is just saying is that you have to really consider and unpack the structure of reality. And I think that the way we were talking about it before, it was, really clear. And even when you're initially speaking about the idea of, with Hegel, and the idea of stepping out and actually understanding and developing your own identity, and stepping out of like kind of differentiating yourself out of social norm. I mean, I consider that to be a different, a level of consciousness. And then a higher level of consciousness that you're thinking about how your relationships are actually structured and what are the nature of those relationships. So then how do I can step outside the narratives that are then created that Ari was talking about a little bit earlier. So I just think that the most important thing is if we're talking about what Donald was getting to with this idea of courage, that that courage is essentially why are you being courageous in the first place? And then how courageous you will be determined by essentially your how strongly you feel about your beliefs. And then that's why a lot of the early Christians, they would
pray for them.
they would obviously they'd go all the way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean,
You're breaking up again there, Joe.
That's and you have to respect that to some. I mean, but you really buy into it. I mean, so whatever you want to do. Hey, if that's okay. I'm done.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I mean, you're raising critically important question here, which is, so, if virtues are supposed to be important for us to organize our lives around, why? How the heck are we supposed to, identify what they are? What validity do they even have? And what is the basis for this argument? And you're right, this is the level of philosophical understanding without which all ethics is a kind of sleepwalking. And you made the point well that we have to dig down to this question of, so what is the point of all of this? See you next week, Rainer. Thanks for joining us. It's easy to claim that we should live a virtuous life, but what is the basis for it? Why is it something to be believed and to be trusted to? And the answer from the ancient world is complicated. And it's at least dual, because as Stephen alludes to, the Roman concept of virtue is so different from the Greek concept of arete. That the Roman virtue has so much to do with manliness, which is related to courage. Being in a highly patriarchal society that's also a warrior culture. The men are the ones going out to conquer, and therefore they're the ones who supposedly have to cultivate all the courage, and therefore all the other virtues that follow from courage. And so is like virile, is the same root as virtue. They're derived from that. But the Greek concept arete is so much richer than the Roman concept. And where the Roman one is, do you want to be a slave? No, then you need virtue. It's a fairly straightforward one. Virtue is the fist, and if you don't have the fist, then someone else is going to use their fist on you. So eat or be eaten is kind of the central concept of virtue. Hidden, it's the foundation hidden underneath the Roman concept of virtue. But the Greek concept of arete is so much richer, because it ties to this notion that every animal species needs to live some specific way of life, a concrete way of life at which they can survive and reproduce. And in which, if they survive and reproduce, they will not only be a blessing to themselves and their species, but they'll be a blessing to the ecosystem that they're a part of, so that the longer they do it, the healthier the ecosystem is, and the longer they can keep doing it. The goal is to have that kind of weave into the larger fabric of nature. And that in order to do that, you need to exploit some kind of life, a zoe, whether it's, you're the people of the corn, or you're the people of cat, who raise cattle, or whether you're the fishermen. There's some zoe that your life is dependent upon. And the life that you construct around that zoe is your bios. You're capable of surviving because you have a successful bios that exploits that zoe, and between the two, it weaves you into the larger realm of phusis, or nature. And the trick to the whole thing, the recipe to it, and I didn't understand this 4 years ago. And it was through doing these seminars and the research for them that I found the Greek references to back it up. This is where arete comes into play. Every bios has to be a way in which, in this particular respect, you have all your competitors beat. You know, the cheetah is faster than the lion. It just is. And likewise, the lion has advantages over the cheetah when it comes to pack hunting because it's the only pack animal among the felines. Well, yeah, among the felines, it's the only pack animal. So they have even though in theory they're part of the same family, they have a completely different bios. And in order to live that bios, they need different arati. Lions need communication and ways to resolve conflict and ways to coordinate their hunting like wolves do. Well, differently than wolves, but analogous to wolves. And cheetahs don't need that. They don't usually hunt together. They almost always hunt solitary, but they have to be very, very sneaky and they have to be very, very fast so they can creep up as close as possible and get close enough that they can then sprint the rest of the way and succeed. These are different forms of excellence. And that form of excellence is the key to unlock the bios, the way of life that makes it possible for the species to survive. And the Greeks are saying that is exactly the case for human beings. And the only difference is that for each other animal species, there's one bios, and it's the right bios. And you need the arete to unlock it. And so your genetics will give you the propensity to have that arete and will give you the sophrosune that makes you obsessed with the things you ought to be obsessed with in order to develop that skill set and that focus and that way of life. And the problem for human beings is we have many I don't know what the biota. We have many possible bioses that could work for us. We're the animal that can have more than one specific kind of way of life that we grow into. And for that to work, that means we have to be able to have more than one possible arete. It depends on which bios. If we're a fisherman human, or if we're a carpenter human, or if we're a cattle raising human, whatever it is, it's got its own way of life, its own bios, and that bios has its own arete or arete that unlock it. And if we don't have the right arete for the bios that we're trying to pursue, we're going to fail. And we know that we'll fail because look at history, and thus the teaching of history, the passing along of stories, tragedies, making sure people understand what happens when you have a mismatch, and all of this becomes a different kind of framework for virtue than anything the Romans had, and certainly different from anything the medievals had, because in the medievals, they're the virtues because they're what God wants you to do. Do what God wants you to do, or you're going to be in some form of trouble. And God's going to give you the pattern in a way that's simple enough for your simple mortal mind to keep track of, and that is, here's a list of virtues. I suggest you cultivate them. And in the modern world, virtue is your brand. We don't really believe in virtues. We believe in ideals, which are empty things that you can promise and then not deliver as long as it keeps the money flowing through the marketplace. So we're as Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and Arendt and others, have Philip Reef, I think, was one of the and Alistair McIntyre on both of these said this is one of the key characteristics of moderns is that we are virtuous. We have virtues as we define virtue, but our definition of virtue is something that both medievals and ancients would find empty, is vacuous. It's not binding upon us the way that Roman virtu or Greek arete are binding upon them. If you're going to add something, Joe, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is where also, you were talking about this idea of excellence, and even the way you think of arete, it's conceptually like what is excellence, and then you're finding your excellence within that. So the virtues themselves, you find what is justice. Well, you find justice within your experience, and it can't. My point being is that the minute it's a set of rules just based off of a pattern, it actually starts to kind of get away from your nature, right? So that, and there's this lack of consideration within that framework. I really like the examples of what the animals do, like how they know what it is, because what happens is that we sometimes manage ourselves to a narrative, instead of actually managing ourselves to ourselves And in that process, things actually become really screwed up. So
Yeah. So thanks for bringing that up. I mean, it's relevant to what Ari said, and of course, it's directly relevant to the text. I mean, we've been talking about character here, and all of this is how the Greeks conceive of character, and this is what Paul and Jesus and others have been marinating in when they start talking and writing in this way that gets captured. It's half of what they've been marinating in. The other half being Judaism. Um, so Donald, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Well, I think some people wonder how virtue ever arises in existentialist. Why it's all not just escapist. But I think there are two real experiences that we all have. One, we choose poorly and we realize it. You know, I did this and it didn't work very well at all. It didn't get me a result that I liked or made me better or felt good about. And the other is somebody else treats us justly or unjustly. People seem to, they may not know what justice is, but almost everybody knows when they've been treated unjustly. And these are concrete, existential, gnostic type experiences that can begin our quest for understanding virtue, how to develop sophrosune for ourselves. Since that was your word last year, I just wanted to throw it in a few times.
He still uses that word all the time.
All the time. Yeah. Yeah, it was the last topic we did on chapter 4. We were almost done, and I had the insight that I'd missed something critical, and it was Sophrosune. And then we went for another 3 months, I think, just talking Sophrosune. It was like, I finally arrived at Aristotle. All these years I've been reading him and missing the point. It's Sophrosune. Everything is Sophrosune. That's what it's all about.
Well, it's, how do you become aware of that? Mostly when you screw up, you realize, it's one thing, people get over doing ill to others pretty quickly. but but doing bad things to yourself, maybe it motivates you.
Yeah. I like to imagine there will be some later stage in the evolution of Homo sapiens when harming others actually causes us pain. And we might learn from it more than we do now. It's too easy to get over other people's suffering on our behalf. So I'm gonna just do one fragment of Thomas this week, and then take us on to paragraph 13 because there's really chewy stuff in paragraph 13. And I wanted to do the retrospective for Rayner while he was here to give him um, the background. So this is saying 3, and I'll give us the link here to the Early Christian Writings website, like so. And there's a lot of different translations, but there's some interesting things in this third saying. Jesus said, "If those who lead you say to you, 'See, the kingdom is in heaven,' then the birds of the heaven will go before you. If they say to you, 'It is in the sea,' then the fish will go before you. But the kingdom is within you and is outside of you. When you know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will know that you are the sons of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you are in poverty, and you are poverty." And let me tell you, I'm hearing Ari's dissertation on the relationship between God and man all over the second half of this. It illuminates it heavily. But there are a couple of things that we want to draw our attention to, and one of them is know yourselves. If you don't hear Gnothi say out and ringing all over that, then we're really kind of missing this. And certainly the Jesus Seminar, which for each one of the fragments gives us a bunch of parallels, like in this case in Luke and Mark and Matthew and elsewhere. One of the things that they really draw our attention to is Nothi Seauton. And so you have to understand this from the perspective of Nothi Seauton. And if you do, then you see that everything that starts with when you know yourselves to the end of this fragment is just heavily classical Greek. You could see, if you think about this, from a Delphic perspective, you can see how Thomas is saying that the living Jesus said, basically Greek wisdom in which he has woven some this concept of the living Father into this otherwise fundamentally ancient Greek value proposition, right? And it's one of the points that Harold Bloom makes is that the Gnostics love the Gospel of Thomas, but there's no evidence that the Gnostics wrote the Gospel of Thomas or that Thomas was a Gnostic. He says there are many things that traditional Gnostics like Valentinus, who we'll talk about, much later, that he says that are completely absent from anywhere in the Gospel of Thomas. A lot of the core Gnostic concepts are just not present. And it's why Bloom says what we're looking at in Thomas is something older than Gnosticism. And it's, if it is a reflection of Jesus's authentic sayings, then Jesus is definitely crossing ancient Greek wisdom with, and then this is where he says something interesting. And it might be next week before Ari gets all of his guns loaded for this, because I think this will be an interesting point for him to comment on, is that Harold Bloom wrote a book called The Book of J, in which he talks about the idea that, who were the different authors of the different books of the Torah and so forth. And his conception is that by the time, by the first century BCE and CE, the rabbinical tradition, the priesthood tradition that is dominating then is heavily influenced by Ezra and the theology of the era of Ezra. But Bloom's sense is that the books of Moses are not just older than the books, from Ezra on, but rather represent a different theology, a different conception of the divine, and that it's recognizably different. In fact, almost antagonistic. The concept of who is God the Father, not in a Christian sense, but in a Jewish sense. Who is this Yahweh, and what is he like, and what does he want? That before Ezra, during the Mosaic period, it is a completely different kind of God than the kind of God that is the God of the temple and the sacrifices and the recurring practices that are finally ended when the Romans invade and tear down the temple. And what Bloom, and I'm bringing this up, Harold Bloom. For those of you who don't know, Harold Bloom died a few years ago. He's a famous literary, probably the most famous English language literary critic. He dominated English literature studies for many decades, from the 60s through until his death. And his big push, and one of his big breakthroughs conceptually, was the concept of the anxiety of influence, that everyone who sets out to write a new thing is haunted by the great writers before them. And they cannot ignore the writers before them. If they ignore the writers who came before them, they'll be a second-rate writer at best. They have to either rebel against the earlier writers who were great, or embrace those earlier writers, but they can't ignore them. And so he built this whole literary theory of tracing influence, who's wrestling with the same issues, who's expressing things the same way. And he's obsessed with literary characters. He loves literary characters. He likes them more than he likes real people most of the time. He says his relationship to Juliet is more passionate than any romantic relationship he ever had in his life. So the way she talks about love, my love is boundless as the ocean. He loves to quote that line. He's like, then that's somebody you can really attach yourself to. They've got more than enough for everybody and everything. So the point is, with this background, Harold Bloom, in some ways, despite being absolutely nothing like Friedrich Nietzsche, he has something in common with Friedrich Nietzsche. That both of them are people who made their living interrogating a text, trying to find the authentic voice in the text. Nietzsche, as part of the 19th century Germans, is trying to figure out where has the text been corrupted, where has a later scribe inserted something that is out of pace with the spirit of the rest of the text, and how you use that to figure out what the voice is. And all of that is the setup for Kenneth writing this book in the first place, that there are worldviews, and you can learn to know that worldview just like I can come to know Sharon's voice. You know, if Sharon misses one of these seminars, as everybody else will testify, there comes a point where I say, if Sharon were here, she'd want us to go back to the text right now. So let's go do that, right? We start to understand each other and sense what would that person want, and that's what Nietzsche was doing in the 19th century. And these German scholars are trying to figure out what's the authentic original text and where are the corruptions. This is what Harold Bloom does when he is trying to trace the anxiety of influence. Who has Yeats been reading, and who is Yeats comfortable with, who is his predecessors, who he wants to be like, and who makes Yeats really angry or uncomfortable, who he wants to rebel against. Like Bloom talks about Salinger, Catcher in the Rye, and he talks about even more than that, James Joyce, especially James Joyce, Ulysses. He says, the reason that James Joyce's writing is so weird is because James Joyce has decided to try to jettison Shakespeare. His way of resolving the anxiety of influence is anything Shakespeare ever said, I don't ever want to have. I don't want any of his figures of speech. I don't want his metaphors. I don't want his approach to writing. I want to go back to the basics before Shakespeare and figure out how to write all over again. And it makes Ulysses a strange read, right? We're so marinating in Shakespeare that the English language itself sounds bizarre without Shakespeare's voice all over it. So this is the kind of thing Harold Bloom does, which means that when he reads the books of Moses and the rest of the Jewish literature, he's reading it with an eye towards who's the author, what is the author's voice, and what is the author's worldview. And so his argument, I'm belaboring this to just give the background to set this up. For anyone who hasn't ever read Harold Bloom, you could pick up his book, The Western Canon, which is a great one. Or you could just get this Gospel of Thomas book in which he writes the last 10 pages. And the last 10 pages are his interpretation of the Gospel of Thomas. So that's handy. Oh, in fact, I forgot to put that. Let me paste the title of this one anyway into the chat. I'll do this one and the Jesus Seminar one, and I'll put them both in there so that people can chase down the books. Anyway,
Can I ask you a quick question before we move on? It's more of a clarifying question.
Please.
So when he's doing this, is he doing something like the scholarly work of like, which you're probably familiar with, like E and J and P and D, where there's different authors? Is he doing something like that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sounds.
He was a major J theorist. He wrote a whole book called The Book of J.
Oh, okay, great.
And so in the Book of J, he's trying to lay out what he thinks the early Jewish theology of Yahweh was like, and he sets it up in opposition against the later Ezra version of God. And so in the Gospel of Thomas, in his interpretation, he says when he reads these fragments from Thomas's quoting Jesus, he doesn't see the God of Ezra. He says he doesn't think Jesus believed in the God of Ezra. He thinks Jesus believed in the God of David and Solomon and J, the older Yahweh. And that part of what makes the Gospel of Thomas so revolutionary to read is that it is, on the one hand, directly setting up your expectations and thwarting them. He has lots of fragments where he goes after your mother and your father. And he does it not because he doesn't believe in motherhood or fatherhood, but because he's trying to shake up people's sense of authority and who do you trust and who do you believe. And some of that survives into Mark, for example. Is that if you don't hate your parents, you can't love me. Some version of that's in Mark. And he doesn't literally mean go hate your parents. He means you got to be able to question, the deepest things that you're attached to if you're going to be ready for this revolutionary new view of what's possible. And there's more of that in Thomas by far than there are in the other four Gospels. And Bloom's argument is that what you're seeing here is that Jesus, whether he found something in a cave or he found some old teacher or what have you, somehow Jesus has got a hold of the older Yahweh tradition in which the Jews' relationship to theology was different than it was, in the temple era, and that he's basically having a big theological argument with the status quo of his day, which might explain why the status quo didn't care much for him. He's basically questioning the basis of their authority. So this bit about Gnothi Seauton and when you know yourselves, this fragment right here that Thomas is saying Jesus said, we know the Greeks are obsessed with this. The Greeks talk relentlessly about Delphi and know yourself and all that. But I also want to draw your attention to the sentence before that. He sets up this thing about, what if it's in heaven, then the birds would get there first. If it's in the sea, then the fish would get there first. But it's somewhere they can't get there first because it's within you and outside of you at the same time. This is, Harold Bloom says, this is almost, if you had to pick a single fragment out of all of the Gospel of Thomas and say, where is the heart of his theology? Said part of it's right here. The kingdom is within you and it is outside of you. That this concept some of this is echoed later on in the other four Gospels, but it's pretty central. And I bring it up because you may recall most of the fragments of Heraclitus, we don't know what order they were in, but the exception is we know what the first fragment was because it is well attested. More than one person said, here is how his book opened. So it's like this is and here's the first fragment of Heraclitus. Although this logos is eternally valid, yet men are unable to understand it. Not only before hearing it, but even after they have heard it for the first time. That is to say, although all things come to pass in accordance with this logos, men seem to be quite without any experience of it, at least if they are judged in the light of such words and deeds as I am here setting forth. My own method is to distinguish each thing according to its nature, kata phusin, right? Which Aristotle won't shut up about a century later. Kata phusin, and to specify how it behaves. Other men, on the contrary, are as forgetful and heedless in their waking moments of what is going on around and within them, ding, 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 as they are during sleep. Now, during the first 2 years of this seminar, I had an epiphany one day, and I came in and said that I'd always read past this and thought the around and within them was just filler language. But I finally compared this to some of Heraclitus's other fragments, in which he says, man is not rational, only what encompasses him, i.e., what is around him, is rational. And that was when I finally understood when he specifically talks about what is around us. He's talking about the world of nature. And nature has character. And your character is your nature, and your character is within you. So there is a nature around you, and there is a nature within you. This is what Heraclitus is talking about. He's saying most men are completely forgetful and heedless, even though apparently they claim to be awake, but you wouldn't know it. It's like they're asleep. They ignore so much of nature around them, and they ignore so much of their personal nature that's within them. And this we know from Aristotle and others these are core Greek concerns. The dual, that our amphibious nature, that we inhabit these two infinities, and that we have to learn about both of them. If we skip either lesson, we're in trouble. Because either we don't know what's going on around us, in which case we're walking off cliffs and stepping into minefields, or we don't know what's going on within us, and that means we don't understand how our character is warping the way that we perceive the world. And now we're back to not seeing the world the way that it actually is. This is all tied up with know yourself and Gnothi Seauton, which is why, going back to the Thomas fragment, if he says the kingdom is within you and it is outside of you, a Heraclitean Greek or Aristotelian Greek interpretation of this sentence would be that the kingdom is nature. He's talking about the natural world, the laws of nature, the cosmos, how the cosmos operates, the truth of things. And then when he goes on to say, when you know yourselves, i.e., your own character, then you will be known, and you will know that you are the sons of the living Father. But if you do not know yourselves, then you are in poverty, and you are poverty. And this is very similar to this notion of the sleepwalker, who is who is a problem for everybody around him because he's passionately reacting to things that only he can see. And he's dispassionately failing to react to really important things that are going on around him that only he can't see. There is a lot of ancient Greek value system in this third saying of Jesus from the Gospel of Thomas. It's remarkable. It's remarkable. So anyway, I wanted to share that, and partially this is to underscore why there are several Gospels of Thomas. It's helpful that the early Christian writing site has what it has, but it doesn't have Harold Bloom's commentary. So if you want the commentary, you have to get the book. And the same is true. I mean, you get a little bit of commentary, but not most of it. And the same is true for the Jesus Seminar version, the five Gospels. The early Christian writing site tries to quote what it can, but it doesn't have room to just verbatim put the whole book online in that website. So it's good to supplement with that if you really want to get at the authentic Thomas, because often it is in this additional commentary, like in the part I was describing about what Harold Bloom had to say about Thomas, that you get a deeper understanding than you can get from Wikipedia or a Google search or anything else. Because among the things that Bloom says, now that I've shown you the saying, I can underscore why does Bloom say this is not a Gnostic text, despite the fact that the Gnostics all revered it. And he says, and he quotes this part specifically, he says, the Gnostics are all about escaping this world. The Gnostics are obsessed with the idea that we don't belong in this world. This world was created by a demiurge, and they're alluding to Plato and the concept of the demiurge. They're saying this world wasn't made by God. This world was made by a servant of God, and he botched the job, and we're all trapped in this mess, and we're not supposed to be here. And so Gnosticism, which is mostly from the 2nd and 3rd centuries, it offers a teaching system to help you escape this veil of tears and get to where you're supposed to go. And some of that filters into modern forms of Christianity and the escapist version of heaven. Oh, this is a terrible world of sins, but that's okay. God will show us the way out and we'll be able to escape. That's a very Gnostic idea, despite the fact that the medieval church that promoted it actually hated Gnosticism and tried to stamp it out. But Thomas is saying the opposite. The kingdom is right here. The kingdom isn't like heaven. It's not when you escape, you'll get to go to the kingdom and God help us all escape. No, the kingdom is right here. It's inside you and it's around you. The kingdom of heaven is heaven on earth and heavenly relationship to our own character, weaving together the whole. This is nothing a Gnostic ever would have said. As Bloom says, Valentinus, who's one of the most eloquent of the Gnostic scholars, of writers, he never would have written a sentence like this. But it certainly has proto or quasi-Gnostic feelings to it. So again, this is part of why he argues that if Thomas is authentic, then the authentic Jesus is much stranger than any of the later 4 Gospels would lead us to think. He says Mark comes the closest. Mark's cranky Jesus has moments where you get a whiff of the Jesus of Thomas. But the more you go into Matthew, Luke, and John, the farther away you get from this riddling, confrontational Jesus who's trying to wake us up. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, so I'll be very brief this time. But I think that this is probably also highlighting obviously what we talk about here quite often is this idea of agency and contingency, right? So this idea of inside and outside, so that you don't exist in a vacuum. And this is why you're inside in order to act out. This is why being self-aware is actually so important, because it has an idea like the relationship that you have with other people. However, if you're stuck inside, then you don't necessarily recognize what's around you. And then what happens with that is you don't realize that the circumstances that you're in, one, your perspective on reality is limited, but number two, they also have an impact on your development. And what happens is it's very easy at that point to damn somebody. And so if you think about it from that perspective, if you have an intermediary that then is saying what is absolutely right and then how to behave, and then so damning others is a little bit easier within that context. Even though there's concepts of forgiveness within that. So again, it's like this whole idea of like the reason to know yourself. If you get stuck inside, it's no longer about a relationship anymore with the external world, or the environment or nature you're in, or the circumstances that you're in. Anyway, so I just think, it's looking in to act out, but you can't act out if you don't look in.
Yeah.
So it's just that interesting dynamic that's really was captured in what you just read. And so that, yeah, it kind of, if not, the idea of sleepwalking is you give away your autonomy, whatever autonomy that you have. So it really doesn't matter, what your agency is,
Yes.
if you give it away. So from that perspective.
Yeah, right on, Joe. Yeah. This is really juicy, chewy stuff. There is a lot going on in this saying. And in the corresponding Heraclitus and in the Kenneth text that we're riffing on here. And after I call on Ari, I'm gonna anticipate Sharon and bring us back to the text. I'm gonna take us on to the first sentence of paragraph 13. But first, Ari, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, very briefly, I wanted to ask Joe, because I have this analogy. It seems to work well for me, but really, I'm going to make the joke here. The gospel, according to Joe, is agency versus contingency. And for me, I'm seeing agency as finite and contingency as infinite. And the meeting between them is where the finite confronts the infinite. And essentially, this has to be done through narrative. Something we studied in other groups is this is Michael Levin's idea to biology is if you have a finite amount of energy or finite amount of entropy and choices, and it's interacting with the infinite world around it, it has to pick a few data points to then go from, and that's essentially creating narrative. And for me, it sounds a lot like agency versus contingency is really the confrontation between the finite and the infinite. And I was just curious if he had thoughts on that.
I don't think that the two are actually in conflict with one another, in my opinion. It's more or less, it's an interesting way of kind of looking at it, is the idea you have a limited amount of energy, therefore in your relationship with the external world, and even how you expend that energy, therefore is, you have limited. And yes, we do have limited capacity. So I do think there's that. But when I think of the infinite and the finite, I'm thinking of it more in metaphysical terms. And so the actual nature of reality. So what is it that you believe, how reality is structured? And so that's slightly different. And when I think of the agency and contingency aspect of it, although I thought you really, captured it in an interesting way that I'd not considered before. That's I have a little bit slightly different. It's more mine was in full metaphysical terms. The narrative aspect of it, I think, is absolutely accurate in that whatever narrative that you then believe, we spoke about this just a moment ago, is that the narrative that you buy into will likely drive your ethical system. So that's kind of where it's and that could impact how to what degree you're going to utilize your agency. But yeah, so I was looking at that as slightly different. Anyway, I can go on about the infinite and the finite for a long time, especially the distinction between Christianity as well as versus the Greeks.
There's juicy stuff here.
There's a lot. Yeah. I mean, that's the whole idea of Christ, is that it came down is the finite. Anyway, I don't want to, it's a lot. That's a lot. That's a whole lot.
It's going to take us this whole year to just do the
Yeah,
hacking, right?
Yeah, it is interesting though. Think about it in those terms. Anyway, yeah, yeah, that would take a long time. But yeah, I'd love to actually engage more about that because I
Yeah.
think it obviously relates to consciousness.
I agree. It's going to be a recurring theme. We're gonna hit it a lot. Sharon wants to add something. Go ahead, Sharon. Come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
I've been listening to this discussion and I just want to make sure I understand it. As you know, I'm very simple. In fact, the first sentence in the next paragraph kind of encapsulates what we were all saying. But I believe, and I want to start from the very beginning where we started out talking about courage, right? I think the reason we have to be courageous is because it determines our actions. And our actions are motivated by our values, which is part of our character. And also, now this is a part of it, the subjective truth. And I don't know if that falls under the realm of contingency, because subjective truth is how you interpret the environment, right? Or how you interpret what you see going around you. And sometimes it's not necessarily accurate. So I just want to make sure that that capsulation
Yes.
explains what's been going on, because it's a lot of
Yes.
corners.
Well, you and Ari and Joe have set up this first couple of sentences perfectly, perfectly from paragraph 13. And the reason is we can think of agency as finite in the sense that our conscious mind only has 7 plus or minus 2 registers. That's about as finite as you get. And we only live a finite amount of time. So we only have so much time to learn about the world. So how does this finite agency express itself when the world is infinite, which means we can't ever learn all of the consequences of our actions? We can't always anticipate what's going to happen when we act in the world. And this is one of the major thrusts of storytelling, like Robert McKee says in his book Story, and like Aristotle says in his works on poetics, that part of what makes a story powerful is the law of unintended consequences. The character is ripe for change and full of will. They have agency, and they set out to solve a problem that they have in what seems to them the most reasonable, possible, obvious way. And yet, when they do, the problem isn't solved, but instead something else happens that they totally didn't expect. And now they're seeing the law of unintended consequences happening because their finite agency wasn't able to anticipate the infinite number of things that could happen. Something happened that surprised them. They were missing part of the picture. And as McKee says, the spine of the story is these gaps, because after things don't turn out the way they want, they have some emotional charge. Are they amused? Are they disappointed? Are they excited? How do they feel about the fact that it came out different? But from the new starting position, armed with this new piece of information, they once again say, well, now how do I get what I want? And they try a new revised action that given that new piece of information, it too seems like the perfectly most obvious, reasonable thing to do. But once again, says Robert McKee, there's another gap between expectation and reality. It doesn't turn out the way that they want, more unintended consequences. And McKee says, and this is where it gets interesting. It's not just the finite versus the infinite, although that's how it starts, but rather that as the arc grows and this accumulation of emotional charges builds up, there comes a point in the story when the protagonist starts to question their desire. What if I want the wrong thing? What if my desire has led me astray? All I wanted was the one ring to fight Sauron with. I didn't realize it was going to corrupt me and turn me into the very evil I was trying to confront. It's like you gradually, whether it's that or whether it's the girl that you have a crush on, you realize that you love her for shallow reasons. It's only because of her appearance, and it's the girl next to you who you've been ignoring the whole time, who's smart and kind and all that stuff. Is maybe I actually should be with this person instead of the one I've been chasing. There's a million variations on it, but there comes a point when what happens is you realize it's not just the nature around you that's too big to keep track of. It's also the nature within you that's full of hidden things you didn't anticipate. And that's what sets up this sentence so perfectly, because he says the truth of spirit is that the life people see is ultimately a field of meanings they themselves have created for themselves, right? The Rorschach test effect, spawned unwittingly from within. And the unwitting refers to the, as Heraclitus puts it, the infinite depths of our character, our nature. We don't know. There all of the dark, obscure urges and longings within us that motivate our rational mind to make the choices it does.
The
And
spirit is not finite.
the spirit is infinite, right?
Yes.
The spirit is infinite. And so our finite will or agency is standing between two infinities. And it's all too easy for it to forget about the infinity within and to focus on the external problem. And only through, as Aeschylus says, only through suffering are we put into a position where we start to question our assumptions about ourselves. Because at least when you run your bicycle into a tree, you can see the tree and the bicycle and figure out what happened. But when you pursue something with all your desire, and then one day you wake up and somehow you don't care anymore, and you don't want that thing, and you don't know what to do now in the absence of that desire, and you don't know where your desire went. What happened to me? Why don't I care about this? You're dealing with the fact that there's something as real as a bicycle or a tree, except it's inside you and it's invisible and intangible. The spirit is a difficult realm. It's easy to miss. It's easy to underestimate. And if there's one thing that Jesus is saying about these relationships, it is that we are all underestimating the world of spirit, and we have to pay it more attention than the ancients did, especially the late ancient period, the corrupt Roman Empire. It got too materialistic. It was too focused on, I don't like what that guy said. I'll send my army in and cut his head off. It was very physical, the Roman Empire. And Jesus is saying there is a lot more going on here, and it is very complex. And a lot of it has to do with that invisible nature within us that is also infinite, just like the infinite world around us. We underestimate it at our peril. Joe, what's on your mind?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, no, really quickly, I just appreciated the idea, the way you framed that, the infinite and the finite within the relationship of the individual themselves. Because this is the whole idea that the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. And so that the reason that is because you're starting to make connections between things. And when you make those connections between things, that you're actually recognizing how vast, I don't know, the universe is. You can, I don't know, you could phrase that however you would like. But those are feedback loops, and it does matter, like essentially the experience, the quality of the experience itself. But again, the more connections that you make, let's just say somebody that learns multiple different belief systems, and they realize, oh, how much more that they haven't like kind of looked at from reality from a different perspective, and then you realize there's a whole other world out there. So that's when it's kind of that relationship is definitely agency and contingency, because the contingency is that you're being exposed to those things.
Yes.
So that's where that comes back to that. So it's interesting from that perspective. So I think Ari was obviously onto something.
Yeah. It's really interesting. So yeah, the realm of the spirit, right? This is one of the ways that Kenneth shorthands the difference between the ancient and medieval world. As he calls the ancient world the realm the epoch or realm of nature, and he calls the medieval world the epoch or realm of the spirit. Says, we've shifted focus from the outer nature to the inner nature, and what is its lawfulness? What are the laws of growth of character? What are we to do about this? How is it to influence our politics and our religion and our economies and everything else? How do we take it more into account than the late Rome did? Ari, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
So I wanted to frame something that, of course, I'm going to be smuggling my confirmation bias. I can't help it, but I'll try my best. That there's two things that I think I'm weaving together here. One is the neuroscience, according to Carl Friston, and the other is the Jewish perspective, which is essentially that you were like a image of God, which just means that there's God is this infinite being that's outside of us and inside of us, that we're also some infinite being that's just inside of us, and that there's essentially in the mathematics. So Carl Friston is a neuroscientist, but he's really a mathematician in a lot of ways. It's really beyond me in a lot of ways, but at the same time, I can grasp it somewhat. There's this idea of a Markov process. And this is all about computer language stuff too, which is algorithms. We have a predictive coding, which takes essentially a bunch of variables and weights how probabilistic they are to occur or not occur. Something like, I'm going to go to the store and or I'm going to go to the restaurant and I can either buy French fries, hamburgers, or hot dogs, and then I assign myself a variable like, oh, there's a 70% chance of a hot dog today, and then based on the fact that you've had a hot dog every day for the last week, you make that variable. No, it's not a 70%, it's a 90%, right? So you weight each variable, and essentially says, long story short for this, all sort of consciousness is an amalgamation of many different variables that are all interacting with each other, but they're interacting in the moment based on what they think has happened in the past, and then weighting what they think based on what has happened in the past, what will happen in the future. And essentially, he equates this to that all natural systems have what's called an inner state, an inner sort of, and this is it's hard to imagine. There's a set of information on the inside, and there's a set of information on the outside, and how they're interacting. And the weird thing is, which is magic in this case, is each one of these things emerges on their own naturally, meaning like the information will naturally gravitate into a couple of sets. And there's an internal set. So your almost like your narrative will naturally emerge on its own, which variables you choose and then what to weight them. And then also similar like the universe around us, the way it is a set of information, that those also have some sort of natural ways of self-organizing. And essentially, with this internal state, which is an internal infinity, and then you have an external infinity, there is a point of contact, like a membrane, like a cell that's got stuff inside of it and stuff outside of it, is managing what's going in and out all the time. And he believes that consciousness is called this Markov blanket, where the internal state meets the external state and has what's called a gradient descent, which is trying to minimize the errors of prediction, which we call entropy, or what he calls free energy. So it's kind of minimizing surprise. We don't want to have things that happen to us where I thought I was walking, all of a sudden there's a big fat hole and I fall and I die, right? I want to minimize surprise. We're very risk averse creatures. But if there's something new that I can predict that's exciting, like, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, or some treasure at the end of this treasure map hunt, then I'm going to go for it because I can increase my internal state with more stuff, essentially more energy, and I can do it in a way where I can navigate the external world without sort of messing up too much. And to me, this really reflects this nature of we have an internal spirit that is infinite. Now, infinite here, I'm going to translate math here. Infinity in math is really just a fancy word for saying a singularity, where there's too much, just there's no way of computing anymore. And that works really well with a spiritual language of a unity of sorts. There's a unified God, there's a unified me. That's a singularity, which sort of breaks math. And essentially, there's an infinity inside me, a singularity, and there's an infinity outside of me, but between them is a finite point of contact, which is where my consciousness lives. I'm not my consciousness, according to this argument. I am more than my consciousness. But my consciousness is where I have awareness and where I have agency, because I can manage or at least perceive what's going in and out of these between the internal state and the external state. And essentially, this would be a robust version of my saying where the finite meets the infinite. You have an infinite inside that's confronting an infinite outside, but a point of contact that's where finite things exist. It has to, this membrane by definition has to be finite. And so therefore, to me, that point of contact between the infinities is where you have the finite confronting the infinity, which really makes sense, where me is from a spiritual language. Again, this is my own confirmation bias on how I see the soul and whatever. So I'm going to smuggle in my own baggage, but I'm going to go with it, that I have an internal soul and it's infinite, and there's an external God that's infinite, but the point of contact between them, whether in time or space, is finite. And that's where my consciousness has this essentially agency, gets to do its thing. That's it. I'm done. Thanks.
I have a quick question. So where's the conscience in all of this?
Are you saying conscience, or is conscience like consciousness? Oh, you're muted, Sharon. You're muted again.
Oh, I said, I don't know. I'm asking. You said
So
the
in this,
point between the finite and the infinite is your consciousness, because that's
yeah.
probably what modulates behavior. So where is the conscience? Are they the one and the same thing?
So
I'm
there's
just
more
asking.
than
I
there.
don't know.
Let's do it like this, like a real cell. There's an internal membrane and an external membrane, and there's a point in between, right? So there's probably layer within that Markov blanket of consciousness. There's like layers within it, and one of those is going to be like Vernuft or something, with the idea that you can abstract within your consciousness. So my consciousness is this begriff sort of feeling thing. Well, then there's another point of contact that gets outside of that, which is sort of be able to see outside of its consciousness. So it's essentially layers, kind of like Shrek and the Onion thing. It gets complicated and there's layers, and conscience would be a reflection on consciousness. It would be another Markov blanket to that. It would be another predictive aspect of prediction, right? So it's like an extra layer of experience, something that's outside. It's Rick said it very nicely. This is where you could just go back to what Rick said earlier and put it into the process of there's a layer cake of consciousness. And the description of that layer cake, I think, is very much what Rick was saying earlier. But in the mathematical description, it's almost like a membrane where you have the bilipid layer. There's multiple aspects. There's an internal dimension within the external. That's a good way of putting it. There's an external thing, and there's an internalness to that externalness. And it probably seems to get messed up in there. I don't really have that so well. That's where I'm just going to go to like, it's beyond me. But it seems like there's more going on inside of there that has some self-governing system of its own self-emergence, which sounds like really paradoxical. And again, these types of self-referencing systems, where then there's a self-referencing system within the self-referencing system that is both inside and outside of the self-referencing system. So and I don't think language, or my understanding, my access to language, is not going to give a good answer. I'll rely to Rick here to use much more eloquent language to try and sort out my nonsense.
Complexity.
It's complex.
It's complex,
But
and I don't have all the answers. I don't.
It's complex, but it uses apparently simple paradoxical structures to generate its complexity. It's part of what Heraclitus reminds us of over and over, is that you can achieve an incredible amount of complexity from just a few simple things if you arrange them into a dialectic, because all of a sudden they become capable of opposites, which normal simple systems can't do. You string the string to the wood, and you have a bow, and suddenly it's this dynamic system that you never would have suspected from the wood or the string alone. Neither of them seem to suggest anything about hurling arrows through the air, But this system, once it's or a lyre, that you get music out of this thing once you string the wood. You wouldn't have suspected it from either of the two pieces separately. But the very cunning way in which they're harnessed to each other into an opposition generates all of this music and power, and that's evidently what's going on in the structure of consciousness of Homo sapiens. The inner world and the outer world, they meet in this kind of finite translation zone. This small, like Ari was describing, this kind of this small finite area has to decide what is it going to take into itself from the outside and what is it going to take into itself from the inside. And these interpretive frameworks that we're talking about evidently play a major role in that. So I was gonna there is this Thales quote: "Phusis is to cosmos as psyche is to somos." Remember, psyche includes the concepts of soul and spirit, and so this idea that what makes us alive, or rather, not what makes us alive, but the sum total of the differences between being dead and alive, all the living parts, all the things that were good about being alive, all the things that made us interesting, that's the psyche, the soul and the spirit. And that it's generated by the body. It is in the nature of the body to sing its psyche. Like it's a breath, it's a song. And what Thales says that was so revolutionary for me. I mean, this was quoted in F.M. Cornford. I think it was From Religion to Philosophy. Is this other half of the equation that says if if the Greeks believe that everything is an organism, then it follows that the universe is an organism, right? All of it together is an organism. And the organism that the universe is called the cosmos. And just like that, the cosmos is the body of the universe, but why it behaves the way it does, all the interesting things about nature, that's physis. That's the word that the Greeks always use for nature, physis, which of course is strongly related to psyche and therefore to ethos and character. So there is this way in which there are some equations here between the laws of nature and the laws of the soul and the spirit that are being alluded to by Thales. And then later writers, and this is where translators get this stuff right. Later writers, when they're translating Aristotle or Plato, they mistake the fact that Plato and Aristotle were hugely acquainted with Thales. They knew Thales's core propositions by heart. They've been talking about them for centuries. And so they take for granted some of these relationships of meaning between the soul and the body and nature and its character. And they just, and so when they write their sentences, you kind of have to carry this Thales sentence around with you as a decoder ring. Every time Aristotle talks about kata phusin, you're like, hey, that's physis again. So now we're both simultaneously talking about how the cosmos works, and we're talking about how our own inner character works to control our agency and our behavior from within. It's just such an interesting thing. The second sentence of paragraph 13 really is a good follow-up to the first sentence, and then I'm going to start doing some unpacking with you guys. He said, this is remember we were just talking about the fact that well, I'll say it again. The truth of spirit is that the life people see is ultimately a field of meanings they themselves have created for themselves, spawned unwittingly from within. And then he follows up when he says, that is the degree and form of creation that finite spirit is capable of, which leaves us ultimately the chief subjects of our own unthought about authority, and which leaves most humans the conformist victims of the relative unoriginality of their own constructed inner world. He's talking about douloi and benausoi, finite spirit. That's douloi and benausoi, the two half-witted strategies to building a character and a life and an ethos. They ultimately are self-blinding. If you cleave to begriff, you're missing the world of Verstand. If you cleave to Verstand, you're missing the world of begriff. And half of the picture or more is erased from you when you adopt one of these half-witted strategies, and that makes your spirit cramped and finite. This is what he's alluding to. He's not saying all spirit is finite. He's saying this is a problem of douloi and benausoi specifically. Aristoi have infinite spirit, or let's say the potential, infinite potential for spirit, because they have unimprisoned themselves from one or the other of these two faculties. They've not let either one be the master. They've said we have to dilate our mind to encompass both worldviews, the worldview of naive gnosis and the worldview of naive noesis, and put them together in a way that is a grown-up mind that lets us envision things beyond what we currently think. And so now the spirit can dilate and you can think things you've never thought before. This is what's being appealed to in these fragments of Jesus when he keeps talking through parables about the gifts of the spirit and the loaves and the fishes. If they're physical loaves and fishes, then you're stuck. There's only so much to go around. But if what we're granting is the solidarity with one another, to not let anybody go hungry and to find a solution, because in our spirits we are committed to one another, that could be infinite. And it opens up our minds to look for other solutions that we wouldn't have looked for if all we were thinking about is how do I divide up this one fish and this one loaf of bread. He's trying to get us to think beyond the slavish mentality of a doulos or a benausos. He's trying to get us to realize that in the realm of the spirit, we can find possibilities that we previously thought were impossible because we're dilating our mind to see a larger world. So anyway, and he when he's talking about leaves us ultimately the chief subjects of our own unthought about authority. Again, if we don't think about our character and its nature, if we don't cultivate it to dilate it, to open up new possibilities, then we're being ruled by, right? Character's fate. We're being ruled by a claustrophobic chief, or we're being ruled by a claustrophobic authority. The daimon that rules over us is a claustrophobic. It's a disdaimon that's cutting off possibilities from us. And when we do that, if we live one of these half-witted lives, there's not room for true originality. This is this Greek concept that to become an actual individual requires that you dilate and develop your character. If you don't dilate and develop your character, you're still operating at one of those half-witted levels. And at those half-witted levels, you don't have room for originality. You can't think outside the box. The box defines you. And as a result, you end up being a cliche, right? So if you're a doulos, you're the kind of cliche that's a walking appetite, or a walking set of traumas, or a walking your emotions, your experiences, your memories. They basically rule you so completely that anybody could script what you would do next. You're totally predictable. It's like, oh God, he's hungry again. Hide the cookies. We know this guy loves his cookies, right? This is what he is. He's a doulos. And in the case of a Benausos, you're like a walking tape recorder. If it's you if you absolutely subscribe to a particular ideology, then anybody who's read the books about that ideology already knows everything you'll ever say. You're never going to say something that isn't found in those books. So all you're doing is reciting the mantras. You're just calculating the foregone conclusions from the premises that your ideology has given you. And you can't be a person like that. You're just a walking tape recorder. Or a lot. Yeah, zombie or robot. This is Ari. Doulos is a zombie, a Benausos is a robot. They're neither of them is living a fully authentic human life. Heraclitus compares the doulic life to the life of a beast of burden. When he says every beast must be driven to pasture by blows, he's saying the cow's too stupid to know where to go next. You have to hit it and drive it because it's not able to think in terms of sophrosune. And by it, he's talking about people, right? This is what Diogenes is alluding to when he says the proper conduct of life requires right reason or a leash. He's saying, either you put in the work and develop your character to become a whole person who's able to think about the world in a healthy way, or you need to be leashed to somebody who does it for you. Somebody's got to think in a healthy way. If your body is being run by a character that is either oblivious to or disregards what's healthy and good, then you're a walking, talking chaos. You're a menace to yourself and others. And this is where we get the ancient Greek worldview. All right, so these openings. Oh, sorry, I saw you came off mute, Sharon. You want to add something?
Oh, well, one of the things that constantly fascinates me is the development of character is the road less traveled with us human beings. And I always wonder, why is that? And it comes back to where we began. It takes courage. It takes courage to face the difficult task of developing your character. So we're coming right back to where we started, Donald.
Yes. And Alcoholics Anonymous has some great wisdom around this stuff. They say the biggest problem holding back an alcoholic is that they don't want to admit that they're an alcoholic. It's why it's number one. If you can't get past number one, you're never going to get to any of the rest of the steps. Step one is you have to admit you've got a problem. And for many people, admitting that they're fallible and that they screw up is how they get punished, or were punished in school or at home or where have you. And now they're terrified of ever acknowledging that they're mortal and that they are capable of doing shameful things. They're afraid and defensive. And so they think that the way that you handle these sorts of shames is that you need to cover them up. Nobody's allowed to talk about them, and you need to lie through your teeth about them. Make sure nobody ever suspects the truth. They get this shame relationship to their true inner nature. And because of that shame relationship, they're stuck in the bottle. They can't get out of it because to get out of it, you have to admit you're in the bottle, right? You have to say, yep, here I am in a bottle. And for many people, that's too scary. It's just too scary. They can't do it. You know, over the idea. And, you know, again, if I do write a book on philosophy, this is where I'm going to go with this. All of our other flaws, not just alcoholism, all of our other character flaws follow the same pattern. We're ashamed to be human. We expect that we're supposed to be perfect. And we get defensive and frightened about confronting these shameful parts of ourselves. And so we cover them up instead of fixing them. We you know, instead of cultivating the garden, we put black plastic over the whole thing and say, what garden? I don't have a garden. I don't know what you're talking about. You have to trust me when I tell you, if I do have a garden, it's the Garden of Eden, it's the best thing ever, and there's nothing wrong with it. And this is how we relate to our own characters. We sort of are afraid to grapple with its actual condition. And if we don't grapple with its actual condition, how are we going to grow anything? You have to go in there and dig up the mess. That's what you have to do. You have to weed the thing. You can't just say weeds. I've never heard of a weed. I don't have any weeds. You have weeds. Shut up. You know, that doesn't lead anywhere good as a gardener. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I always wonder about this word spirit, but philosophers always talk about spirit as if it's an idea. And you look at the way the ancients talked about spirit, they talked about it like it was a force. It's something that animates matter. Matter no longer just sits there, it becomes something that is alive when the spirit is breathed into it. And I look at, you know, the modern culture, for example, well, we used to worship Jesus and say, this is a principle we look up to. But, you know, the modern socialist has decided, well, I'm getting rid of Jesus because he's better than me. And that's not equality. Oh, I'll create a devil. I'll create Adolf Hitler. Now, if I'm not a Nazi, I must be good. This is the modern socialist. Whereas the Christian used to say, there is something better than me in the universe, and that is Jesus, and I need to look up to him. But the modern socialist says, no, just stay as you are. As long as you're not Hitler, you are good. Now, when I look at the book of Revelation, I don't think it's anything to do with a future prediction other than that there is a fate in it for man. I think John of Patmos was talking about not the enemy without, not Nero, not Caesar in Rome. Yeah, he's making my life tough. But the biggest enemy I can ever find is the enemy within. And I think John of Patmos was talking about an initiation. And when he met the spirit, he felt terror and fear and said, mountains, bury me, hide me from the spirit. He was talking about a spirit which was a real force, not simply a set of ideas.
That's right.
Not the vague way philosophers keep on, you know, moaning, oh, you know, this is a nice idea. That's a good idea. Yes. Well, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. It's one of the things that typifies this particular line of existentialist philosophy. I mean, Hegel couldn't be any clearer about it. The spirit is absolutely real. It's the only way that an existentialist would agree that there's no such thing as the spirit is if a corpse is every bit as fun a conversationalist as a living person. I mean, if there's no difference between the living and the dead, then, you know, okay, fine, then there's no spirit. But if there's spirit, that is the sum total of the difference between the living and the dead. And everything that a cheetah wants, every time Sharon says, can we go back to the text? Every time Donald says, this makes me think of something that Plato said. Yeah, every time you say, I got to talk about a rationalist and what a rationalist told me, and you will not believe this. And if you're right, we don't believe you. We go, oh my God, that rationalist is crazy. All of that in us, that interesting juice is the spirit at work, because you can't weigh it. You can't measure it with a ruler. It doesn't have a wavelength. All of the like singing a song. It's something that is dramatic and potent and hugely shapes the value of our lives, and yet it 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 how do I say it? The the biggest weakness in crude forms of materialism is that they can't account for either behavior or relationships, because behavior and relationships are things that you can't put in a bucket. They're things that the body does, not things that the body is that can easily be measured. And to the existentialist, these things that the body does and these relationships that it has are every bit as real as the matter of the body itself. The fact that I look forward to talking with you guys every week. I drove 5 hours. I got up at 3:30 in the morning in Eugene, Oregon, so I could leave the house by 4, so I could be here by 9, so I could be in this seminar and talk to you guys today because of the spirit, right? I moved my body from one place to another to get here and be on this call with you because of the spirit. It absolutely is real. I really did that drive through the rain. And if I were dead, my body would have just laid there. It wouldn't have gone anywhere because the body can't want to join the conversation without unless it's generating a spirit that has the desire. So I'm with you, Stephen. And it's part of where the ancient Greek concept of the spirit is rich enough to explain how all of that could be true. And it does so in a way that doesn't contradict materialism. It just requires that materialism dilate itself to be larger than it usually is. The form of materialism that we find is so trivialized and clumsy that it can't account for anything. But that's in some ways that's the artificial byproduct of the medieval conception of the world. Once we stripped meaning out of nature and moved it into a transcendental God, it left us with a concept that the ancients had never had before: meaningless matter. The ancients didn't believe in meaningless matter. Only the medievals believed in meaningless matter. They believed you need God to give it meaning from the outside. That's what transcendental means, that the meaning comes from outside. But the original concept, the Greek concept, was an immanental meaning. The matter itself has intelligence and desire and life that it generates from within itself. The electron wants the proton. It wants to orbit, baby. And the more energized it is, the further out it wants to orbit, but only in certain places. There's all this behavior and intelligence without a brain that's nevertheless implicit in even one of the simplest things in the cosmos, an electron. And to the Greeks, that's perfectly compatible with materialism, because matter is immanent, full of meaning. But to the modern materialist, matter is the medieval dead thing, and therefore it can't be a source of meaning. And therefore, there's an absolute separation between matter and spirit. Materialism ends up collapsing, as Stephen, as you're rightly pointing out, into this clumsy thing that's not capable of explaining most of what happens. Most of what happens isn't a bunch of bodies being piled up in a stack. It's the bodies getting up and doing things. So, yeah. Before we break today, I just want to emphasize these two opening sentences of paragraph 13. This is some serious Kenneth Smith concern here, right? I mean, he talks a lot about the problem of the inability of people to see themselves or the world around them, the way that our interpretive frameworks block us from getting access to the reality. And in a sense, it's the theme of the whole book that he's summarizing in these two sentences. He's saying them this time in a way that underscores the importance of spirit, but it's still the same core concern, which is, how is character fate? How does our unconscious interpretive framework change the way we see things? And at the beginning of this book, he quotes William Blake, C. Wright Mills, W.H. Auden, Kierkegaard, Paul Valery, and Hannah Arendt. And in all of these quotes, he's reiterating this theme over and over and over. And so next week, I'll start with those quotes, and then we can move on to the sentences that follow and do more Gospel of Thomas. But
Yeah, go ahead. We're done. I'm done. See you next week, guys.
see you next week. Bye, Sharon.
Bye.
Bye bye, everybody. Take care.
Yes. Thank you, Harry.